Chapter 11. A Way Out. Chapter text abnormal, worthless, useless. No, no. Knock your bloody teeth out. I'll have none of your freakishness in my home. Needs to stay locked in like a rabid animal. No, stop. That little girl. What was her name? Some sort of color. Oh, she left ere a few days back, or weeks, was it? Went to live with her mum, please. You think you have anywhere to run, boy. Think you'd be out here alone if there was anyone who cared to look for you. Mr. Potter. Stop. A hand is shaking his shoulder. Stop! Get off! No! Harry jerked awake, gasping for air, to see Snape hovering over him. Harry's breathing slowed a bit, but he turned his head away, squeezing his eyes shut and biting down hard enough on his lip to taste blood. Weak, pitiful. Why does he have to see me like this? Harry's eyes shot open again when Snape's hand settled on his shoulder, and he very nearly flinched away before his body managed to remember that it wasn't under attack. He lay there silently, then stiffened in surprise when Snape reached out with his other hand slowly to prise Harry's lower lip from between his teeth. He allowed it, a bit bemusedly, feeling oddly calmed by the gesture. "Did you attempt to clear your mind before bed?" Snape's tone wasn't accusing. Harry shuddered, closing his eyes. "Didn't help. I'm so pathetic. That is not an uncommon occurrence." Harry looked up again. Snape was standing in the same position, his hand still resting on Harry's shoulder, an unreadable expression on his face. "Would you perhaps like some assistance?" "No, I should be able to do it myself. Makes me weak if I need help. I am weak, pathetic, useless. Vernon was right about that. Mr. Potter." No, no, thank you, sir." Snape, for a moment, looked as though he wanted to object. He just sighed, however, and stepped back. "Very well. Do not hesitate to seek out my assistance, should you need it." Harry nodded, and Snape, after another long, contemplative look, turned and swept from the room. Harry felt an odd sense of loss as he watched Snape go. He shoved his hand under his pillow to clench a fist around the handle of his penknife. His hand trembled. "I wonder what it would be like," Harry thought idly, leaning back into his armchair, "if I didn't have to deal with any of this anymore. What would it be like not to feel anything, not to worry about anything, not to care? An existence without pain or fear, simply cool blankness. What about the opposite, like happiness or pleasure? But that was out of reach for him, he just knew. I never asked to be born. I never asked for any of this. Yet people seem to think that they can do whatever they want with me, like I'm their personal property. It's never going to end. If it's not the Dursleys, it's Dumbledore. And even if I got away from him, someone else would just take over. If they won't go away, I'll have to." Harry glanced up absently, his eyes flitting towards the clock on the wall, and he noticed that it was already 5 minutes past lunchtime. He didn't care. "I'm not hungry, and no one can make me eat. No one. I can do whatever I please." Harry hunched back further into his seat, trying to focus on the book he'd had resting on his lap for the past hour and a half. Nonverbal spells require not only an advanced level of magical power and prowess, but a strong focus and understanding of the workings of the spell being cast is vital for success as well. It is for that reason that nonverbal spells are generally not attempted until the start of Newt level, Mr. Potter. Harry purposefully kept his head down, his eyes trained on the next passage. Newt level studies. It has been found that those who are practiced in mind magics, or as discovered in a recent study published in the Middle East Journal of Magical Arts and Sciences, Brailovsky and Mizrahi, 1988, learned in the musical arts. "You will look at me when I speak to you, Potter," Snape said sharply. Harry stiffened, then looked up reluctantly. "Yes, sir?" he asked in a flat tone. Snape looked as though he was searching himself for the last vestiges of patience he possessed. "It is nearly 10 minutes past lunchtime. I am quite certain you are aware. I'm not hungry." Snape's face tightened. "Nonetheless, you will eat. Come." "I'd rather not, sir," Harry replied, eyes on Snape's left shoulder. He started slightly when he saw the shoulder tighten, and he looked towards Snape's face. "Have I given you the impression that that was a request?" he asked in a slightly dangerous tone. "Why can't he just let me be?" "You told me once, sir," Harry said through gritted teeth, "that you don't care whether or not I attend meals." Snape looked exceedingly frustrated, his breaths coming out in short, deliberate bursts. "I have indeed told you that. However, I have also stated that I regret my initial negligence and intend to rectify it. I don't feel like eating. You can't force me. I believe you will find that I can. Do you plan to shove food down my— Watch yourself, Potter. You are treading on thin ice." Harry knew that he was crossing a line, and every ounce of reason he possessed was screaming at him to shut the hell up, but he didn't care. He was far too angry. How dare these people abandon him for years, only to show up and try to control him as soon as it was convenient for them? Harry pressed his lips together, glaring at Snape, refusing to move from his chair. "Mr. Potter," Snape said, in a voice that was very nearly a hiss, "should you continue to disobey me, you will find that it is well within my capabilities to bar you from the library." Harry was almost shaking with a fury that was entirely disproportionate to the situation. Snape had every right to refuse him access to the library. He owned it, after all. But the logical side of his brain was growing fainter, and his anger was rising so rapidly that he felt his fingers tingling with magic. With difficulty, Harry managed to rein in his anger just enough to refrain from destroying the library a second time. He looked up slowly to meet Snape's gaze, the man's face tight with irritation. "Have we reached an understanding, Mr. Potter?" Condescending git. Harry rose without looking at Snape, angry and humiliated, and followed the man out of the room in silence. Before they reached the kitchen, Snape paused, turning to face Harry. He tensed, holding his breath. "In the future, I will not be quite so tolerant of your rudeness. You would do well to keep that in mind, or you just may find yourself spending the afternoon scrubbing cauldrons," Snape said tersely. Harry nodded shortly, beginning to feel a bit idiotic. He had gotten into an argument because Snape wanted him to eat. Considering that he'd spent most of his life scrounging for food, his behavior had been downright irrational. He sat in his usual place, piling whatever food was nearest on his plate, looking everywhere but at Snape. "I'm being ungrateful. He's giving me food and everything, and he should throw me out." At that thought, Harry felt a bit panicky. He'd end up entirely under the control of Dumbledore if that happened. "I have to apologize." Harry looked up hesitantly. "Sir?" he asked in a tentative whisper. "Yes," Snape asked in a neutral, if short, tone. "He doesn't sound too angry. Or maybe he is, and is just pretending not to be." I'm. Harry's voice trailed off, and he bit his lip and turned his head. "I'm sorry for being a rude, ungrateful little. Is there something you wish to say?" Snape asked impatiently. Harry meant to say sorry, but what came out of his mouth in an almost inaudible tone was, "Please don't send me away." Snape raised his eyebrows. "Pardon, I didn't quite catch that. God, I sound pathetic. I'm sorry for—" "Please don't kick me out," Harry said, only slightly more loudly, hating how his voice was shaking. Snape exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He opened them to look at Harry, who was looking back at him with what he knew was poorly concealed trepidation. "You will not be sent away, Mr. Potter. You will remain here for as long as necessary. However, should you continue to refuse to communicate—" Harry felt his breath catch in his chest. So that was the way it was. He was welcome here only if he complied with the rules. If not, he was out. And he didn't even know all the rules. Classic. He'd end up breaking them beyond repair at some point, and then he'd be at the mercy of Dumbledore. He did not want to hear any more. He let his fork drop onto his plate and dashed out of the room and out of the house as quickly as he could. Had Harry only remained for a few moments longer, he would have heard the rest of Snape's statement. "Your time here will be less than enjoyable for both of us." And perhaps, had Harry not run away, he would have felt Snape's hand brush his shoulder lightly, telling him that his presence in his home was more than welcome, even if he did insist on defying rules put in place for his own benefit. But he heard none of it. Harry scampered up his tree, feeling both guilty and betrayed. Snape didn't want him. But it was his own fault for not being good enough. He was never good enough, not for anyone. I was for Jade. I hate her. I hate her for leaving. She never even said goodbye, so maybe she didn't care after all. Harry's hand reached into his pocket of its own accord and pulled out his penknife. He stared into the blade, his reflection staring back at him, distorted by the shape of the knife. He moved it away quickly into the path of a ray of sunlight. The blade glinted oddly. "Why is it sunny?" "I want rain. Rain makes everything go away, but so can this." Harry felt the familiar calmness wash over him as he ran a finger carefully across the sharp edge of the blade. "No one would care if I did it. Snape wouldn't care, and it would serve Dumbledore right. And the wizarding world would have to find a shiny new boy who lived. Maybe next time they'll pick one who isn't damaged goods, stupid Jade. She didn't need me, so I don't need her. It wouldn't matter to her either." Harry scraped the blade across a tree branch, carving in his initials in several rough motions. HJP there. He'd left his mark on the one safe place nature offered. A tree. The trees would remember him, even if he was gone. Perhaps the trees would miss him when no humans would. Harry thought he heard the front door of the house open, although, the tree being a considerable distance from it, he couldn't be sure. He looked toward the house and saw Snape standing at the entrance. Harry could not make out his expression, but he looked back blankly, surreptitiously sliding the penknife into his pocket. After a few moments, Snape turned and re-entered the house. Harry thought he would have felt relieved, but he didn't. He just felt a brief flash of an unidentifiable but painful emotion, and then nothing. Harry floated through the rest of the day like a ghost. He showed up for dinner, dutifully clearing his plate, all the while refusing to look at Snape. He sat in the library, staring at the same spot on the page, but for how long he didn't know. He lay in bed, flashes of terror and fury engulfing his senses, so much so that he scarcely slept. Even if he had been able to sleep, he knew it would not offer him any respite. All Harry had was his penknife, which, to him, was the one thing that kept him grounded in reality, reminding him that there was a way out. Otherwise, he didn't know where he would be. Harry awoke the next morning scarcely an hour after he'd finally drifted off. His eyes were gritty, and he felt sluggish and disoriented. A quick shower woke him up some, but he still felt exhausted. Better than the nightmares, Harry thought darkly, rubbing at his eyes. But I shouldn't be so tired. It isn't the first time I couldn't get to sleep. When Harry further examined the situation, he realized that the cause of his exhaustion wasn't solely sleep deprivation. I'm just tired of everything. Harry dragged himself downstairs to the kitchen, stumbling a bit on the way. He sat down, barely noticing what he was serving himself, and once again avoiding Snape's gaze. He lifted his fork, which felt abnormally heavy, and the food on his plate appeared distinctly unappetizing. "Did you not sleep well last night, Mr. Potter?" Harry heard Snape ask. He shrugged listlessly, picking at his food. "Did you experience nightmares?" Harry looked up at that. Why did Snape keep having to ask him questions like that? What was he, a 5-year-old who woke up crying every night? And why did Snape even have to know about them at all? "Number, stop asking me questions," Harry bit out through gritted teeth. No one had the right to know anything. Why couldn't they all just leave him alone? He wanted to kick something. Hard. What's to stop me? I have nothing to lose anyway. Harry rammed his foot into the table leg, causing it to shake violently, and he watched with satisfaction as a glass of water crashed to the floor and shattered, its contents splattering everywhere. In another wave of recklessness, he swung out an arm and knocked his plate to the floor, and shards of china and bits of food joined the mess on the floor. The satisfied feeling left him quite abruptly when he heard a distinct clearing of a throat. "Mr. Potter," Harry looked up slowly at the icy tone, his insides all but curdling with dread. Snape looked unmistakably angry, his eyes narrowed to slits, and his knuckles white with how tightly they were clenching the edge of the table. "Can you provide for me any sort of explanation for your actions?" Harry looked down, shaking his head slightly. He had no explanation. He didn't have the faintest clue as to why he'd just done what he did. Harry heard Snape take several deep, controlled breaths. "Look at me." He looked up, blanking his face. He didn't care what happened next. He didn't. "I understand," Snape said in a tone of deliberate calm, "that your judgment at present may be clouded as a result of a sleepless night. However, that does not give you leave to behave as a young child in the midst of a temper tantrum." "I don't care what he says. I don't care about anything. I don't care. I don't care. Have you anything to say?" Harry shook his head faintly, struggling to refrain from looking away. Oddly, Snape didn't look quite so angry anymore. The man's hands were no longer clenching the table, and his eyes were narrowed, no longer with fury, but with something else that Harry couldn't read. Snape rose from his seat, clearing the table and the mess on the floor with a quick wave of his wand. "Follow me." It did not cross Harry's mind to disobey, yet his feet felt as though they were made of lead as followed Snape out of the kitchen, and he couldn't quite draw a full breath. He'd finally done it this time. He'd crossed the line, he'd pushed too far, and now he'd finally get what was coming to him, and he had no one to blame but himself. He'd forgotten what this was like. In a way, a year on his own had softened him. Sure, he'd been on the wrong end of a fist and a knife, and he'd spent nights unable to bring himself to close his eyes for fear of that man who kept looking at him with this weird sort of glint in his eyes. And he'd been cold and wet and injured more times than he could count, but he'd still been free. He'd been free of the utter helplessness and dread that accompanied the knowledge that he'd angered the person who had full control over every aspect of his life, and that there was no way to escape the consequences for his real or perceived misdeeds. Harry followed Snape into a room had never been in before. He'd only stood outside it while eavesdropping on Dumbledore and Snape the day he'd first arrived. It turned out to be a small study, with a wide desk piled with books and parchment, a couple of wooden chairs and several ever-present bookshelves. Mr. Potter. Harry slowly lifted his head, pressing his lips together and clenching his fists to stop his hands from shaking. Stand in that corner of the room. Snape pointed, and remain there until further notice. I will be at my desk. Sorry. Did he just send me to a corner? What the bloody hell is that supposed to mean? I don't know what you mean, Harry finally replied, feeling at a complete loss. Snape raised his eyebrows. I believe my instructions were quite clear. You're clearly incapable of behaving in a manner befitting your age at present, so you will spend some time in the corner, contemplating your actions. Snape stood there, waiting, while Harry walked slowly to the corner he'd been directed to, leaning against the wall when he reached it. What's the point of this? What is he trying to say, or do, or whatever? Turn around, Mr. Potter. Harry gave Snape a confused look. Snape looked irritated. Face the wall and contemplate your behavior. Harry remained where he was, frozen in place. Do as I say. Harry felt uncontrollable terror begin to take hold of him. Turn around, he couldn't. He'd be facing away from the door and he wouldn't be able to see. He wouldn't know if. No. I'm not turning around. He can't make me. I need to see. I won't. I can't. Mr. Potter, turn. Now Snape definitely sounded angry now, and he looked it too. Harry couldn't breath. He couldn't even move, though his eyes darted back and forth in search for escape routes that he wouldn't be able to take. No, don't make me. Harry gasped and pressed back into the wall as Snape started moving toward him. In that moment, Snape's figure began to grow hazy, and Harry wasn't quite sure where he was. All he knew was that there was an imposing figure moving toward him, and he couldn't escape. But then the figure abruptly stopped moving and began to back away. Harry took that opportunity to move. He dashed out of the room at lightning speed, running up the stairs to his bedroom. Need to hide. Need to hide where no one can get me. The door of his room slammed with the force of Harry's tangible fear as he dashed through it. He grabbed his blanket and curled up with it under his bed, penknife clutched to his chest. As he lay there, his breathing gradually steadied. Snape wouldn't have done anything. Why did I freak out like a lunatic? How the hell do you know he wouldn't do anything? He just wouldn't. But Dumbledore can get in, and I couldn't see the door. Harry shuddered, curling up into a tighter ball. Snape definitely wouldn't want him to stay now. Harry had been rude and disrespectful twice today, and then he'd freaked out and run away, just because Snape had sent him to a corner. Even a 2-year-old would have been capable of doing that. I'm not afraid. I don't need to hide here like a hunted animal. Harry crawled out from under the bed and climbed into it, feeling exhausted despite having awoken so recently. As Harry lay in the midst of a deep yet fitful sleep, Severus stood beside his bed, watching. What am I to do with you? He said in a low tone. You will not communicate your needs. I doubt you even know what they are. Severus reached out and brushed his fingers lightly through the child's hair, careful not to wake him. I cannot discipline you, nor can I even raise my voice without you believing that I might harm you. Harry moaned in his sleep slightly, his forehead crinkling in agitation. I cannot help you if you will not let me, Severus murmured. As it is, I fear that I am only worsening a difficult situation. With a heavy sigh, Severus turned and left the room. The next few days melded into one another, time passing painfully slowly, yet far too rapidly. It felt as though Harry was moving through a thick grey fog, unable to differentiate between what was really happening and what was running through his mind. Sometimes, Harry felt nothing at all, and he moved through his daily routines automatically, yet he experienced none of it. At other times, fury and fear overtook him, leaving him wanting nothing more than to hurt those who had hurt him. He could only imagine, though. There were times, too, when Harry felt an undefinable yet unbearable pain engulf him, a pain that had no cure nor treatment. It was inside him, yet it surrounded him as well, leaving him defenseless and hopeless. Sleep offered no escape. Images of the past combined with fears of his future haunted his dreams whenever he did manage to sleep. His penknife, secured in his pocket, day and night, was what kept him going. It was the way out, the only way. It reminded him that he wasn't truly trapped, and he could escape if he really needed to. It was the only thing that felt real, asterisk Mr. Potter. Harry didn't answer. He hadn't even registered the question. He was somewhere else, far away. Mr. Potter. The sharper tone alerted Harry of the speaker's presence. Yes, sir. You do not look well. I'm fine. You are most certainly not. I am. Cease with the fabrications. I'm not lying. I'm not. I'm completely fine. I've never been more fine. Absolutely, perfectly, 100 perfect fine. Fine, 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 he bolted, ignoring Snape's voice calling after him. Harry lay rigid in his bed, nearly paralyzed with fear. He had not been dreaming. He could not even match the emotion with an image or a memory. He just felt fear. He was fear, and pain, and anguish, and fury. Harry rose slowly and walked, as though in a daze, toward the bathroom, his fist clenched around a small object in his pocket. He entered the bathroom, suddenly imbued with a sense of purpose. He pulled his penknife out of his pocket and carefully laid it on the counter beside the sink. He then lifted the grey bath rug off the floor and hung it over the towel rack, taking care to smooth out any creases. He sat on the closed toilet lid and slowly reached for the penknife, flicking it open and grasping it firmly in his right hand. He dragged the knife through the air, toward the waiting, willing target in the form of a narrow vein in his left wrist. Chapter 12. The Right Words. Chapter text. Severus awoke quite suddenly, feeling a vague sense of foreboding. Long-trained reflexes had him immediately out of bed, wand in hand. It was then when he noticed a faint ringing in his ears. A ringing only he could detect, because it was a charm of his own making to monitor the boy's well-being and alarm him if necessary. But the charm was acting oddly. It would not have woken him on its own as it should have. He doubted he would have woken at all if not for the distinct sense of unease he was experiencing. Severus did not pause to contemplate the matter. He swept rapidly towards the boy's bedroom, prepared for the worst. The boy was not in his bed. His gaze traveled rapidly across the room, and he noticed a thin line of light protruding from the narrow gap between the floor and the bathroom door. He didn't bother to knock. He twisted the doorknob, finding it unlocked, and swung open the door. The first thing he noticed was the bare bathroom floor tiles, spotted with droplets of a dark, wet substance. The rug had been hung, ever so carefully, over the towel rack. At the same time, a faint, metallic scent, only obvious to him due to his spying experience, engulfed his senses. It was then, within a second of his entrance into the room, that he took in the entire scene. The boy was seated on the closed toilet lid, his head tilted downward, eyes gazing unseeingly, face deathly pale. A small blade hung limply from the boy's right fist, and his left hand, palm face up, was resting on his thigh, and there was blood. With a jolt of horror, Severus understood what had happened. Do not make any sudden movements. Mr. Potter, drop the knife, he said, keeping his voice low and smooth. The boy did not look up, but he let it fall to the floor with a faint clatter. Thank you. Stretch out your arm. The child looked up then, his gaze no longer blank. He looked tortured now, his eyes awash with a greater agony than Severus had thought possible for a child as young as he. Can't you leave me here? The boy asked. His voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. Dear Merlin, put the right words in my mouth. No, you can stretch out your arm for me willingly, or I will do it for you. Severus paused, standing carefully still as the boy slowly stretched out his left arm, displaying the deep, bleeding gash across his wrist. Without wasting a moment, Severus waved his wand in several intricate motions, cleaning the wound and knitting it carefully, while surreptitiously performing a quick scan to detect any other injuries. Once confident that the wound was properly healed, and that the child was free of further injury, Severus reached out slowly to tuck his fingers beneath the boy's chin to lift his head. The boy didn't resist. The glassy quality of his eyes suggested that he wasn't fully processing any of the events occurring at present, and when Severus met his gaze, the normally vibrant, intelligent green eyes seemed dulled and vacant. He appeared even smaller than usual, as though the life force that had held him upright had abandoned him. Or perhaps the child had abandoned it. Severus forced himself to focus on the most immediate concern. The boy did not appear to have lost a great deal of blood, but the bleeding hadn't ebbed, and the child looked moments away from collapse. He shifted his grip from the boy's wrist to his upper arm in preparation to lead him out of the room. "You require several potions. Come." Without pausing for a response, Severus gently tugged on the child's arm, pulling him to stand. But when the boy rose, his knees buckled, and his eyes rolled backwards into a faint. Severus cursed, catching the boy before he hit the ground and scooping him up. He walked down 2 flights of stairs to his laboratory, refusing to allow himself to think too hard. He could worry later. He could admonish himself for his neglect of the boy's needs later. Right now, he needed to focus his undivided attention on an ill, injured child. Shifting the boy carefully in his arms, Severus entered the small room adjoining his lab and conjured a cot, then set the boy down on it gingerly. After determining that the boy's vital signs were stable, Severus took several deep breaths. Blood replenisher, iron supplement draft, nerve regenerator, if necessary. Within moments, Severus was by the boy's side, potions in hand. He then loosened the unconscious child's jaws, pouring potions into his open mouth and stroking the throat to prompt the child's swallow reflex. Once the potions were administered, Severus leaned against the wall outside the small room, refusing to allow himself to sit. How could he have missed this? I didn't think to look through his belongings. I didn't know he had any belongings of his own. But that is no excuse. A child under my care was in possession of such a lethal object, and I overlooked it entirely. And why did the monitoring spells fail to work efficiently? Of course, because they were not meant to detect harm the boy deliberately inflicted upon himself. It failed to occur to me to keep that in mind when I set the monitors. The sole reason I detected anything at all was because the child would have died had I waited too long. He had failed. He had utterly, irrevocably failed to do the one job that he'd been entrusted with, the one task he'd sworn to undertake, not only to atone for past mistakes, but because he wanted to. He'd wanted to fix what had nearly broken this young boy in his care, this child that had surprised him at every turn and provoked emotions that he'd long thought buried too deeply to retrieve. Simply put, he'd come to care for the child. He wanted this child to trust him and feel safe in his presence, though Merlin only knew how he could begin to build that trust when Severus had never given his own to anyone else. He could not undo it, this need that had grown so rapidly in him to give whatever he had to this boy, despite whatever pain would come his way upon allowing the boy to breach his own defenses. The sheer horror he'd experienced when he'd realized what the child had felt compelled to do. Harry was no longer just a boy Severus had grudgingly taken in. He was his responsibility, his ward, and he would not shirk his duties. He was in far too deep now, and there was no going back, nor did he want to. Harry opened his eyes and immediately closed them tightly against the light. His fists clenched around what felt like cotton, and the sensation of it had him opening his eyes again, his heart thudding frantically as he glanced around rapidly, unsure of where he was and how he'd gotten there. His eyes caught on a dark figure in his periphery, and he could not contain the panicked gasp that escaped his lungs. He'd taken to sleeping in the grassy, partially concealed area near the homeless shelter, because he couldn't bring himself to actually sleep inside it for fear of someone sending him back to the Dursleys. But that strange man who slept nearby kept looking at him with that odd glint in his eye, and he never bothered to look away when Harry noticed him staring. Had that man taken him somewhere? What did he want? Harry cringed back and wrapped his arms around his chest when the dark figure approached him. He sat up abruptly, then froze when a hand settled on his shoulder, blinking several times until the figure came into full focus. Snape. Recent events made their way steadily back into Harry's awareness. He glanced around the room slowly and found that he was lying on a cot in the room that adjoined Snape's potions lab. Lie back. Harry jumped at the sound of Snape's voice, his shoulders momentarily hunching against his ears before he let them drop, and he allowed Snape to push him backwards against the pillow. Do not sit up. I will raise the back of the cot. Snape flicked his wand, and Harry felt the upper half of his cot push upward, so he was propped up into a half-lying, half-sitting position. Snape then proffered a glass bottle, seemingly out of nowhere, filled with a watery, dark brown substance, and handed it over. Blood replenisher. I gave some to you earlier, but you require a second dose. Harry obediently swallowed the potion, grimacing at its metallic taste. Once Harry had drained the bottle, Snape handed him a glass of water, which Harry gulped down gratefully. He hadn't realized how thirsty he'd been. Snape handed him another potion, pale yellow this time, for weakness and vertigo. Harry swallowed the unpleasantly slimy, but thankfully tasteless brew, and a dizziness and weakness he hadn't even noticed he was experiencing ebbed away, leaving him feeling clear-headed and energized. No, I don't want to feel like this. I was almost there. And then he had to show up. But did he really not want it? Snape's ministrations, and his matter-of-fact approach in dealing with the situation that Harry had created and the inconvenience he'd caused made Harry feel something different. Something other than the unrelenting fury and dread that had been consuming him for ages. He must really not want me to die. Get a grip. He'd be in trouble if I died on his watch. That's why he's doing this. That thought made Harry feel calmer somehow. The lack of conflict was easier to cope with. Snape wordlessly handed him another glass of water, watching as Harry drained it slowly. After a few moments of silence, Snape cleared his throat. I trust you are now feeling well enough to walk. Harry nodded, his eyes on his fingernails, as he rose carefully out of the cot into a standing position. He did feel okay. Physically, at least. I don't want to feel okay. I don't want to feel anything. You will join me in the sitting room, and we will discuss this, Snape said, in a tone Harry couldn't decipher. He allowed Snape to lead him out of the lab and up the stairs to the sitting room, where he was guided to sit on the couch, and Snape, instead of sitting across from him, sat down directly beside him. Harry hunched his shoulders, but that did not prevent Snape from gripping them firmly, turning Harry to face him. Look at me. Harry swallowed, staring resolutely at his lap, unable to lift his head even if he wanted to look away from the familiar, predictable wood of the floor towards whatever expression Snape had on his face. Harry. The use of his first name startled Harry enough to jerk him out of his frozen sort of trance, and he looked up to meet Snape's eyes. Can you explain? It wasn't a demand. Harry could see on the man's face and hear in his voice that it was no more than a question that he desired the answer to. Could Harry explain? Harry opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't speak. He was, just as the first time he'd met the man, trapped in Snape's dark, magnetic gaze, but it was different this time. There was anger there, perhaps, if Harry looked hard enough, but there was also concern, warmth, and something else. No adult had ever looked at him that way. Ever. He'd only ever seen scorn, fury, hatred, and disgust in the eyes of all those who'd been meant to care for him. Snape's gaze was new, singular, and Harry couldn't bear it. He felt a pressure behind his eyes and a stinging in their corners. No crying, but Harry couldn't stop it. Years of pent-up pain, fear, and anguish burst forth from him in a torrent of tears. Harry pulled himself out of Snape's grip, hiding his face in his hands, elbows digging into his thighs. His entire body shook with the force of his sobs and with the effort it took to keep them quiet. After a moment, Harry felt something. An arm was reaching carefully across his shoulder blades, coming to rest on the outside of his upper arm, pulling him close. Harry fought it for a moment, but then gave in, collapsing against Snape's side. They both remained in that position for an undetermined length of time, with Snape's arm holding Harry firmly against his side, while Harry sobbed near silently, his face still hidden in his tear-soaked hands. Snape did not speak, for which Harry was grateful. He did not tell Harry to stop crying. He didn't scorn him for it, nor did he attempt to end the tears by means of comforting words. He just sat with Harry, holding him, allowing him to let out his tears. Eventually, Harry's tears ebbed, and he pulled against Snape's grip. The man released him, giving Harry a few moments to collect himself. Harry wiped his face with his sleeve, too drained to feel embarrassed, as much as he knew he should. Though exhausted, Harry felt as though he'd been relieved of a weight he'd been carrying for years. Had it been the tears or the subsequent comfort that had relieved him of it? Harry looked up when he felt hands on his shoulders. He met Snape's gaze unflinchingly. Why, Harry? Snape's voice was low, almost a whisper, and his eyes did not leave Harry's. They did not even blink, as though the answer to his question was all that mattered. I have to answer, I owe him that much. Why had he done it, and what had driven him to do it now, while his life had been better these past few weeks than it had ever been before. The answer came to him. "I was trying." Harry's voice emerged as a rasp. He cleared his throat, which felt as though it was coated in sawdust. "I was trying too hard to survive to realize that I didn't want to." Harry bit his lip and tried to look away, but Snape grasped his chin, holding his head in place. Harry looked carefully at the man, whose face was lined with tension, and his eyes seemed shadowed with something more than the current predicament, something old. "I know, Harry," Snape said in a low voice, his eyes fully fixed upon Harry's. "I know that the pain can become so great that you cease to feel anything at all. It chokes you, it binds you, until you lose yourself entirely to its clutches, until the pain is all you know and you cannot separate yourself from it." Harry inhaled sharply at those words. He stared at Snape, and that was when he knew. Snape did know. Snape understood what he'd felt and what had driven him to such desperate actions. Snape wasn't angry, he understood, because he'd been there too. You do know," Harry whispered. Snape nodded once slowly, reaching out a hand to grasp Harry's. "As much as it feels as though you are not alone," said Snape, his gaze fixed, focused, and his voice projecting utter conviction. "I should be. I don't need anyone. I can't depend on anyone. I should be able to be alone." Snape seemed to know where Harry's thoughts were going. "You cannot be strong all the time, Harry, nor should you have to be. You can let others in. Allow them to hold you up when you can do so no longer." Harry stared at the man, not blinking even when his eyes started to burn. The words Snape had spoken sounded almost like another language, words too foreign for him to translate into one he understood. But the man's voice required no interpretation. It spoke of so many things Harry did not need to translate. It spoke of certainty, of understanding, and of hard-earned knowledge that might never be shared in words, but conveyed in every way besides. It was a voice that Harry could not disbelieve. "Harry." Harry looked up at Snape's voice, straight into his eyes. Snape's hands were on his shoulders again. They felt warm. "Will you let me, Harry? Will you let me be that person?" Harry did not look away from Snape's eyes. Eyes that could hold secrets, carry burdens that no one else could. They were eyes that would not fail him. Slowly, his gaze never leaving Snape's, Harry nodded. Chapter 13. Just for Now. Chapter text. Snape's hand was warm on Harry's shoulder as he led him upstairs. Harry didn't try to shake it off. He didn't want to. In truth, he felt as if that hand was the one anchor holding him upright. He's right, I really can't do it myself. How pathetic can I get? Now he thinks I'm some mental case that needs counseling, and I just cried all over him like a baby, Harry. Snape's deep voice cut into Harry's internal tirade. Harry looked up to see Snape's face, laced with what he'd come to understand was concern. Snape never really displayed much in the way of facial expression, but now it wasn't quite so hard to decipher. Harry grimaced, looking away. He didn't want pity. Harry set his gaze resolutely forward as Snape escorted him into his bedroom, directing him to sit on the bed. "Please wait here for a moment. Do not leave the room, and I will return momentarily," Snape said in a level tone. Harry nodded and stared at his hands, which were folded neatly on his lap. There was a silent pause where Snape seemed to want to say more, but he then simply turned and left the room, closing the door behind him halfway. Harry examined the inside of his wrist. All that remained of the incision was a faint white line. Yes, that sounded good. Incision. A detached, formal way of expressing what he'd really done. He was not out of control. His actions had been planned, calculated, and if not for Snape. But is that really true? I made it easy for him to stop me. I left the door unlocked and the light on, and I didn't even fight him when he started healing it. True, he could have done it anyway, but still, it's like I wanted him to find out. Did I? Harry looked up as Snape re-entered the room. He was holding a small glass bottle filled with a thick, deep purple substance. "Dreamless sleep," Snape said quietly. "Normally, I would not encourage its use. However, I believe this is a time where an exception can be made." He handed the bottle to Harry, who took it while avoiding Snape's gaze. "He thinks I'm a basket case that needs to be drugged, and he's right." Harry crawled under his covers, and without further hesitation, removed the cork and drained the bottle, almost immediately beginning to feel its effects. It's interesting how quickly potions take effect. Not like normal medicine, Harry thought drowsily as he flopped back into his pillows, barely noticing Snape pulling the empty bottle out of his hand. Through drooping eyelids and rapidly clouding vision, He could just make out the hazy image of Snape, now seated on a chair near the wall. He didn't leave, was Harry's last vague thought before he drifted off. Harry awoke slowly the next morning, feeling a bit groggy. He squinted at the clock, rubbing his eyes, finding it to be nearly 10:30. I never sleep this late. Must be the potion, or being awake for half the night. A bit unsteadily, Harry made his way to the bathroom. He blinked when he saw the spotless floor, rug restored to its proper place. Snape must have cleaned up while I was asleep, my penknife. Harry searched the floor frantically, and then the rest of the room, even the shower, but it wasn't there. Snape, Harry realized. He took it. Harry calmed slightly. Snape probably hadn't wanted to leave it lying around. He'd give it back, he had to. I'll ask him first thing. Harry exited his room, walking towards the stairs, and he stopped in his tracks when he heard Snape's voice. Mr. Potter. Harry turned quickly to see Snape approaching from the other end of the hallway. Harry felt suddenly awkward. After all that had transpired the night before, it was difficult to look the man in the eye. I need the penknife. Just get a grip and ask him. Harry took a deep breath and peered up at Snape, who was looking down at him, his face unreadable. Ah, sir. Harry's voice came out hoarse. He cleared his throat. Do you have my, He made a vague motion with his hand, unable to finish his sentence. Not after what had happened. Snape inclined his head. I do. He pulled it out of his robes. However, disregarding whatever Snape was about to say, Harry reached out for it, but the man shook his head, holding the knife close to his chest. Harry, I'm sure you understand why I cannot give this back to you at the present time. Harry bit his lip. Yes, he understood, but he needed it. It was the only weapon he had, the only thing he really had of his own. I don't care. I need it. He has no right to take it from me. Good. Now Harry felt appropriately angry. It was so much easier than the tangle of overwhelming emotions he'd been grappling with up until now. The fear, the unpleasant ache in his chest, and the consistent, troubling sense that he was moments away from crying again all faded away in the face of his frustration. Sir, I need it, please. Harry refused to sound desperate or to beg. He'd said his piece, and he'd even said please. He wasn't begging. Harry saw a glimmer of something like sympathy in Snape's eyes, but the man shook his head again. I do understand why you feel you require it, but it would be entirely remiss of me to allow you to be in possession of such an object at this time. Please, sir, I won't do that again. I just really need it. Harry hated the pleading tone that had crept into his voice. But damn it, he needed the penknife. Snape exhaled slowly, and Harry could see his jaw tighten. It is not my intention to permanently confiscate the blade from you. It will be returned to you when we both feel that you can handle it responsibly. Oh, so he wasn't keeping it for good. But how long would it take for Snape to believe that Harry could be responsible? Years, probably. I need it now. Give it back. But do you truly believe yourself to be in danger here? Snape cut in. Harry thought for a moment. Only when Dumbledore's here. Otherwise, I don't know. Anything can happen. I need to be prepared. Snape seemed to take Harry's silence as an affirmation. Harry, you are entirely secure here. No one who wishes you harm has the ability to pass through my wards. I, and I alone, determine who may or may not enter the property. He lets Dumbledore in whenever he pleases. But clearly, Snape trusts him, though I can't imagine why. Mr. Potter. Harry looked up, chewing his lip. He mumbled, his voice trailing off. Snape raised his eyebrows, waiting for Harry to continue, but when he did not, Snape blew out a breath. You by now trust that I do not mean you harm. Yes, Harry realized. I do trust that he won't harm me. Why, yes, sir. Snape looked slightly relieved. I will say this. If anyone who steps onto this property, or any person at all, for that matter, attempts anything untoward, I will personally ensure that said individual exists solely to regret it. He reached out and cupped Harry's chin in his hand to tilt up his face in the same manner he had the previous night. You are under my protection, and I do not shirk my duties, ever. Harry stared back at Snape wide-eyed. Apparently satisfied that he'd gotten Harry's attention, the man continued. At the present time, my duties include protecting you from yourself. The urge to cry resurfaced once more, but Harry shoved it back fiercely, pulling out of Snape's grip and turning his face away. He cares. He really does. I don't know why, but he does. Am I understood? Snape said in a stern tone, turning Harry by the shoulders once more to face him. Yes, sir, Harry whispered. Snape was silent for a moment, regarding Harry carefully. Good, come join me for breakfast. He turned and walked down the stairs toward the kitchen, Harry following several paces behind. "You didn't eat yet?" Harry asked tentatively as they sat at the table. "I have not yet had the chance." Because of Harry, probably. Because he was weak and couldn't keep it together, and Mr. Potter, Snape's smooth voice cut in. "Do you plan on eating at any point in the foreseeable future?" Harry nodded, head down, and proceeded to fill his plate, barely noticing what he was serving himself. "He probably thinks I'm an immature nutcase. I cried all over him. I let him hug me, like a needy little. Now he definitely won't want to deal with me anymore. I completely lost it. I let myself go too much. That's not okay. It's weakness. I'm weak. A weak little baby." Harry gripped his fork with unnecessary force, all but smashing his food into a pulp with the prongs. "Harry." Harry looked up reluctantly to focus on Snape's shirt collar. "Do you believe, upon the day's previous events, that I am inclined towards judging you in an unfavorable light?" "Yeah, that sounds about right." Snape, of course, knew what Harry was thinking. He lowered his head slightly to meet Harry's gaze. "You are laboring under a misapprehension. I am in no way judging you, nor has my assessment of you been in any way negatively impacted by your actions." "Why not?" Harry burst out, then almost immediately froze. He could have kicked himself. What had he been thinking, yelling at Snape again? Harry. Harry flinched at the man's tone and the inexplicable absence of anger in it, feeling undone. He watched Snape anxiously, who'd opened his mouth to speak again. "Only the simple-minded and ignorant would dare judge another for their methods of coping with pain," Snape said harshly. Harry stared. "Considering the suffering I've no doubt you have undergone, I am more inclined toward admiration of your forbearance than judgment of your attempt to escape." Harry couldn't help it. His jaw dropped. "Good," Snape said softly. "I have your attention." He pressed his palms flat on the table and leaned closer. "I'm well acquainted with the emotions that may lead to the drastic measures you have felt it necessary to turn to." Harry clenched his fists on his lap, unable to look away even if he wanted to. "The knowledge that I possess puts me in a position to provide you with the help you need, if you would but allow me." Snape's tone had grown sharper and steadily louder, and his face was mere inches away from Harry's. "Aye," Harry whispered. His eyes were darting rapidly left to right, his instincts screaming danger. He ignored those feelings. Snape wasn't lying. This was for real. Snape wanted to help. Snape cared, for whatever unfathomable reason he had. Snape reached out a hand to cover Harry's, which was now resting on the table, slackened. "You need not say anything," he said quietly. He let go of Harry's hand and rose from his seat. "I prefer not to leave you alone at present, so join me in my office while I work. I have books stored there that will undoubtedly pique your interest." Snape flicked his wand to clear the table and swept out of the room. Harry followed him into his office, where the man conjured an armchair not unlike the one Harry often used in the library. Snape then sat at his desk, beginning his work, for which Harry was grateful. It seemed that Snape knew that he needed his space. Once he selected a few books that looked interesting and curled up in the chair, Harry felt almost calm. However odd it was, he felt safe here with Snape. Safe enough, apparently, to begin nodding off after an hour or so of reading. A few times, Harry managed to snap himself back to awareness after feeling his head slowly tilting to the side of its own volition and his eyes drooping. He could only fight it off for so long, though, and he eventually fell asleep completely. And he dreamed. It feels familiar, as though he's been here before but forgot, or buried the memory away. He is in his cupboard in bed, but he's hovering above it, ever so slightly. "Harry." A voice whispers. It sounds distant, but not as though it's far away. It's close, so very close, but he can't quite reach it. He blinks his eyes open several times, and when he squints, he can just make out the visage of a young woman with a shock of red hair. He can't say for sure, but it looks like she's smiling. A smile that's for him, and him alone. And then there's a flash of blinding green light, and a scream, a terrible, agonized scream that carries many layers of meaning, more words within it than if they had been spoken. He feels an awful, searing ache in his chest, not physical, but so much worse. Because he knows what it means, that green light, that scream. He knows it means the indescribable loss of something so very primal, so very needed, that he just might fade away in its absence. But then he feels something else, something powerful enough to briefly overshadow the unbearable ache inside of him. It is fierce, it is warm, and it is older than time. He can see it plainly before him. As the red-haired woman steps into the path of that light, the horrid green light, she leaves something behind. It is her pain and her sorrow, but it is also certainty. Certainty in her choice to walk forward instead of back, to throw herself into the light, because it is for her son. She will do everything for him, give everything to him. She will watch the world burn to ashes if it means he will live, and be happy, even if she will not. It is love, and it keeps him alive. Harry woke quite suddenly at the sensation of a gust of cold wind brushing his face. His eyes shot open, but oddly enough, he wasn't alarmed. He squinted at Snape, who was standing several feet away and holding his wand loosely at his side. I thought it best to wake you, or you might find it difficult to sleep tonight. Harry blinked several times, his vision oddly blurred. When he reached up to rub at his eyes, his hand came away wet. He stared at it for a moment. Had he been crying in his sleep? He tried to wipe away the residual tears with his sleeve surreptitiously, but there was no way Snape hadn't noticed. He straightened in his seat, clearing his throat, and chanced a glance at Snape. The man was staring at him, but he made no move to comment. "Did you just cast a spell on me?" Harry asked quickly, hoping he didn't look as disconcerted as he felt. The man nodded, storing his wand in his robes. It was a modified version of the Ventus spell, which is designed to produce a powerful gust of wind. I thought it the most efficient way to wake you. Harry nodded, blinking away the last vestiges of sleep from his eyes. Is it time for lunch?" he asked. "Just about," Snape said. As Harry trailed behind Snape to the kitchen for lunch, he cast around, a bit desperately, for another question to ask, in the hopes of putting off the imminent conversation he knew he'd have to have with the man at some point. "How do broomsticks work, sir?" Harry asked, after swallowing a bite of food. He just spent the last several hours engrossed in a book about magical sports, and he had been wondering. Snape's lips twitched slightly, as though he knew what Harry's game was but was willing to play along. "I suppose you are asking how broomsticks function in terms of physics," Harry nodded. "Well, have you drawn any conclusions on your own, Mr. Potter?" Harry narrowed his eyes in thought. He considered the functionality of airplanes originally, but just as they hadn't explained the hover charm, they didn't explain brooms either. No, brooms move differently, and they're built differently too. Harry frowned, shaking his head. Snape leaned forward slightly. "I would say that broomsticks move in a manner most similar to rockets." Harry furrowed his brow. How did that make sense? Rockets only ever moved at high speeds, unlike brooms, which could apparently move at varying speeds as well as hover in the air, unmoving. He chewed his lip. "I presume you are aware of the mechanics of rockets." Harry tilted his head. "Maybe a little. Explain what you know." "I know that rockets are propelled by, high-pressure gas, I think," Harry said, straightening his back. Snape inclined his head. "Correct. It is my understanding that rockets move by Newton's third law of equal and opposite reactions. The rocket engine forces high-pressure gas in one direction, causing the rocket to accelerate in the other direction." Harry nodded. "Broomsticks work in much the same way. The magic stored within the broom is released through its bristles, which expand outwards similarly to a rocket. The released energy therefore propels the broom forward." "How is the magic stored in the broom? Is there a spell?" Harry asked. Snape cocked his head slightly, looking thoughtful. "Broomsticks designed for flight cannot be made by just anyone. The development of broomsticks requires extensive knowledge and skill." "Do you know how?" Harry asked. "Are you perhaps interested in pursuing a career in broomstick development, Mr. Potter?" asked Snape, looking a bit amused. By Snape's standards, anyway. Harry shrugged. "I don't know, I was just curious." Snape quirked his lips. "I do not possess extensive knowledge on the subject, nor do I own many books on the topic, however. Perhaps we can procure one for your use." Harry felt his breath catch in his chest. He swallowed hard, looking down. "Thank you." Snape cleared his throat, and Harry looked up again. Snape seemed to be on the verge of speaking, weighing his words, perhaps. "Would you," the man began, "perhaps like to gain some practical experience in that area?" "You have a broom, sir?" Harry asked, holding his breath. Snape inclined his head. "Indeed I do. Would you like to try it for yourself?" That would be the coolest thing ever. Would he really let me? Several memories rose, unbidden, of offers made available, only to scorn Harry for his gullibility in believing that they were genuine. "You want dinner? Well, you won't be getting any." "Would you like to be let out of the cupboard?" "Too bad." Harry shoved the memories away forcefully. Snape wasn't like that. Snape had never said anything he hadn't meant for good or for bad, not to Harry. Harry looked at Snape, who was awaiting his response, though his expression was unreadable. "I would like that, sir." Snape waved his wand, and Harry couldn't help jumping when a broomstick zoomed through the doorway into the man's hand. "Very well," he said briskly. "If you will join me outdoors." Harry followed Snape outside, then took the broom from Snape's proffered hand. He examined it, turning it in his hand delicately. "I'm afraid my broomstick is rather time-worn," Snape said gruffly. "Most children today tend to hanker after the latest models. There are models of broomsticks. That's just strange." Harry turned towards Snape. "How do I?" Snape waved a hand. "I suggest you simply do what comes naturally. I suspect you will have no trouble." Snape's voice sounded a bit hard, and Harry chewed his lip nervously. Snape seemed to notice this and gave Harry a gentle pat on the back. "Go. Do what comes naturally. Akare." Harry swung a leg over the broom, pushed off from the ground, and shot up into the air at an alarming speed. "This is amazing." As Harry zoomed through the air, he felt a jolt of pure joy rip through him. He had never felt such an emotion before. This was different, an entirely indescribable experience. He didn't have to think or to try. It felt as though he and the broom had become one, and he flew as though he'd been born to do so. A wide grin blossomed across his face, his facial muscles feeling oddly tight from lack of use. He laughed, a loud, joyous sound that he'd never heard come from his own mouth. Harry dived, rose, twisted, and turned, flying through rays of sunlight that peeked through wide, fluffy clouds. He felt as though everything that had been wrong with his life, wrong with him, had been left behind on the ground far below. He wasn't the unwanted burden passed around and shoved away. He was just Harry, a wizard boy flying through the air with an ability that was his birthright. Up here, nothing mattered at all except him and the broom. Here, he was strong and capable, far from anything or anyone that meant to hurt him. Zooming through the air, magic crackling around him, Harry was unencumbered. He was free, if just for now. Chapter 14. Fight or Flight. Chapter text. Severus felt somewhat conflicted as he watched Harry take off. He'd been hesitant to allow the child to fly, and not least because of his recent suicide attempt. Yet that hadn't been enough to stop him from giving the child this one good thing among all the mistakes he'd made with the boy. Even if seeing him fly reminded Severus of James Potter, in all his glory, zooming across the Quidditch field as if he owned the place. But the child was not James Potter. Yes, he looked uncannily like his late father, and he'd clearly inherited his skill on a broomstick as well. But he was Harry, a boy who hadn't let himself be broken, no matter how close he'd come. A child with a keen mind and wit that often took Severus by surprise. His eyes were following the child carefully, wand at the ready lest the child attempt a dangerous maneuver, yet a distant noise still managed to startle him. After a moment, he realized what it was. The child was laughing. Severus felt a rush of warmth in his chest upon hearing it. His actions alone had given the boy a chance to really be a child, if just for a short while. In that moment, any lingering unpleasant thoughts relating to James Potter melted away. The child was happy, and if flying gave him such joy, Severus would not hesitate to allow the child flying time whenever he wished it. Severus watched Harry fly for another long while, a faint smile hovering upon his lips. Eventually, the boy landed, far too forcefully in Severus' opinion, and he was about to say as much when he saw the child's face. Harry was smiling, grinning really, his eyes sparkling, cheeks flushed and hair windswept. He handed the broomstick to Severus with the all-too-rare smile lighting up his face. "Thank you, sir," said Harry breathlessly, brushing his tousled hair out of his eyes. Severus quirked his lips at the child, which had Harry smiling shyly back. "I take it that you have enjoyed that, Mr. Potter," said Severus, his gruff tone hiding his discomfort at the child's obvious gratitude. Harry nodded rapidly, the childlike gesture heartening Severus more than he cared to admit. "Yes, sir, it was incredible. I am glad to hear it. You certainly took to it quite well." The boy looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but still smiling nonetheless. Severus motioned toward Harry to follow him, and he led the way inside, broomstick in hand. He noticed Harry looking on a bit wistfully as he stored the broomstick in its cupboard, and he turned to face the child in preparation to rectify that. "You will be allowed to make use of the broom again. There is no reason why you should not be." The boy stared, with a more open expression of surprise than Severus had seen on his face before. "Ah, really, sir?" Severus raised his eyebrows at the boy. "Certainly. I did not make that offer for my health. I rarely fly, so for all intents and purposes, the broom is yours to use." Harry swallowed, looking overwhelmed and bit wary. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though unsure of what to say. "He fears that I may demand something of him in return," Severus realized, feeling a surge of fury at those who had damaged the child so. He was sure not to let his feelings show as not to alarm the boy. "It causes me no trouble to grant you use of the broom. All I expect of you is to exercise caution in all your behaviors," he said pointedly. He felt heartless when the boy flushed and looked away at his statement. It had to be said. Regardless of a short respite, the boy is still struggling greatly. "Yes, sir," Harry mumbled. "Good," said Severus. "Come join me in the lab before lunch if you would." Severus set the boy to brew an altered version of the calming draught, which was designed to produce a more subtle calming effect than the original formulation and was simpler to brew, keeping a sharp eye on him all the while. "I will have to speak with him later. It will upset him, surely, to discuss his past, but it is necessary. I simply must be sure to question him in the correct manner. I may lose him altogether if I push too hard." "I can't believe he did that for me," Harry thought as he mashed his beetle eyes. "He knew I'd like flying, and I didn't even have to ask. He just gave it to me for free. He gives me everything for free, and he teaches me potions just because he knows I enjoy it, even though it's probably an inconvenience for him." Harry wondered if potions were invented regularly, and if Snape had ever done it. "Just ask him. No reason not to. He's answered my questions before." Harry looked up from his beetle eyes towards Snape discreetly. It seemed that the man had paused to allow his potion to simmer and was brushing a stray clump of hair out of his face. "Sir?" Harry asked tentatively. Snape looked up, eyebrows raised. "Yes. Have you ever invented any potions?" "Certainly." "What have you invented? When did you start?" How Snape let out a huff of breath that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. "I began experimenting in my youth," he began, looking a bit amused, as though in reminiscence of past events. "What did you invent then, sir?" "I was a rather vengeful young man, so I set out to exact revenge upon certain individuals who I felt had wronged me. I therefore created a potion meant to induce uncontrollable laughter in the drinker." Harry bit back a laugh. "Did it work?" "Seeing that it landed 6 individuals in the hospital wing, I do believe it did." Harry's lips twitched. "Any others?" Snape looked thoughtful. "I do recall one other meant to induce severe indigestion." "I assume that worked as well, sir?" Harry asked, unable to force back a grin at the thought of what that might entail. Snape smirked. "I was rather fortunate not to be implicated, considering the fallout. He's way too good at this to just teach. You do more than teach potions, don't you?" "Astute observation, Mr. Potter. Was that a yes?" Harry looked at Snape inquiringly. "Do you develop potions now?" Snape nodded, an intent expression on his face. "For many years I have been in correspondence with several potioneers like myself, developing new or improving existing brews. That is such a cool job. I wonder why he teaches. That's probably too personal. I can't ask. What sort of potions have you worked on?" Snape paused as he took a moment to raise the flame beneath his cauldron. "Recently, I have been in correspondence with a colleague to develop what we've named the adrenaline draft, designed to aid in combating severe allergic reactions, particularly in children." He paused, fiddling with the temperature. "Additionally, for the greater part of 6 years, I and several others have been involved in extensive research on the development of the wolfsbane potion, which has been perfected only very recently." "What's the wolfsbane potion?" Harry asked, interestedly. Snape finished stabilizing the heat and looked up again. "You are aware that werewolves do indeed exist?" Harry nodded. In fact, he'd been quite interested to learn that many mythical creatures he had heard of growing up did exist. "The wolfsbane potion allows the drinker to keep their human mind upon the transformation." "How does it work? In the brain, I mean?" Snape looked a bit surprised at the question. He studied Harry carefully for a moment, his gaze unusually soft. Harry lowered his eyes, unsure of what was expected of him. He was relieved when Snape spoke again. "Werewolves, at the time they are bitten, rapidly develop an entirely animalistic area of their brains, which is brought to the forefront at the time of transformation. And on a lesser scale, when the subject loses control of their emotions while in human form. Harry nodded, forgetting entirely about his potion, which was due to be stirred again. The wolfsbane potion, as a result of the interaction of its various ingredients, primarily inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. You are aware of its mechanics, Mr. Potter. Harry nodded. In primary school, he'd once snuck over to the neighboring high school to hide from Dudley and his gang, and he'd found an anatomy textbook in the deserted science classroom. He'd read that a hormone called adrenaline activated the fight or flight reaction in response to perceived danger, and in that moment, a person was driven by pure instinct, animal instinct. Incidentally, it had explained quite a bit about why Harry often felt strangely panicky at seemingly random times. "Mr. Potter, your potion," Snape warned. Harry looked up quickly. He'd left it simmering for far too long, so it was bubbling madly, and the color had darkened considerably. He quickly turned off the flame, stirring rapidly. Once the bubbling had slowed, Harry looked up nervously at Snape. Was he annoyed that Harry had messed up? Snape seemed quite unconcerned. "A handful of mint leaves will suffice as a cooling agent." Harry nodded quickly, obeying, and he was relieved to see that the potion paled and thickened slightly, as it was meant to. "Bottle the potion, Mr. Potter. I believe we can continue our conversation upstairs. It's time for lunch." Harry did so, then followed Snape upstairs to the kitchen for lunch. Once seated, Harry looked up, eager to continue their conversation. Snape swallowed a bite of food. "Ah, yes, we were discussing the impact of the wolfsbane potion on the sympathetic nervous system." Snape paused to take a swallow of water from his glass. "A chemical messenger, acetylcholine, stimulates the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline. You are aware of what those are?" "Yes, sir. They're the fight or flight hormones." "Correct. The wolfsbane potion inhibits the release of acetylcholine, thereby preventing the release of said hormones, which in turn inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. You understand why such a process would allow a werewolf to retain their human mind." Harry chewed his lip. "I suppose the sympathetic nervous system is very active during transformations, and the new area of their brain is activated." "Very good." A thought occurred to Harry just then. What would happen if a non-werewolf took the potion? Snape raised his eyebrows. "A purely hypothetical query, I hope." Harry nodded quickly, suppressing a smile. "Should a non-lycanthrope ingest even a small amount of the wolfsbane potion, it would send them into a deep coma from which they may never wake, and would certainly permanently damage their nervous system, even if they did. I guess that would happen because the potion needs to be really powerful in order to overcome the wolf brain, so a human brain would be completely overwhelmed by it. Have you worked on any other potions, sir?" Harry asked. "As you have not yet begun to eat, I believe we can continue this conversation at a later point in time." Harry nodded reluctantly, realizing that he hadn't yet even served himself. He ate quickly, all the while itching to go to the library to research more on the topic they'd been discussing. The rest of the day continued at a surprisingly calming pace. Harry spent some more time in the lab, discussing Snape's potions work, though Harry took care to pay more attention to his potion while doing so. Later on, Harry joined Snape in his office to read for a while, as Snape did not want to leave Harry on his own. Harry didn't object, though it made him feel like an invalid. He continually reminded himself not to feel resentful of the arrangement. "I did it to myself," Harry told himself firmly. "It's not as though he wants me underfoot at all hours of the day. He's just doing what he has to. I have no right to complain." Despite his inner tirade, Harry couldn't help shifting in his seat, feeling crowded and irritated. It was hard to relax with a book when shut in a small room with another person, even if it was Snape. Every sound seemed amplified, as it often did when Harry felt anxious. The scratching of Snape's quill sounded like nails raking down a blackboard, and even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt jarring. Harry ground his teeth and loosened his grip on his book, allowing it to fall unceremoniously to the floor. He winced at the sound. Snape looked up at the noise, one eyebrow raised. "Sorry, sir," Harry said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I take it you've had enough, Mr. Potter." Snape interjected, not seeming particularly annoyed. Harry nodded, unconsciously rubbing at his eyes. "I think it's time you prepared for bed. I had not noticed the time." Harry immediately tensed at that. "I can't go to bed. I'll have nightmares. I don't want to sleep. I don't want to think." "Harry." Harry looked up, noticing that he'd clutched his arms around his chest and was rocking back and forth in his chair slightly. He stopped moving, feeling foolish. "You cannot take a potion tonight," Snape said slowly. "However, I will assist you with clearing your mind." He cleared off his desk with a quick wave of his wand, rising from his seat. "Come." Harry rose jerkily from his seat, picking up the book he'd dropped and storing it on its shelf. He then followed Snape upstairs, feeling an odd sense of déjà vu. At least Snape wasn't half carrying him upstairs this time. When they reached Harry's room, Snape sat on the chair near the wall, while Harry gathered up his pajamas to change in the bathroom. He emerged a few moments later, teeth brushed and pajama-clad. He climbed into bed, any residual good feelings from the surprisingly enjoyable day had quickly evaporating. Harry hunched a little when Snape walked over. He wasn't a little kid. He didn't need to be put to bed. Even when he had been a toddler, no one had ever put him to bed. Snape seemed to disregard Harry's embarrassment and pushed him back into his pillows. "There is no shame in accepting help, Harry," said Snape quietly, backing up a few feet. Harry looked down, a tight feeling in his throat. "Why do I keep feeling like I want to cry? I don't." Harry felt Snape draw a bit closer, reaching out a hand to rest on the back of his head. He leaned unconsciously into the touch, flitting his eyes away when he felt them burn. Taking a slow, deep breath, Harry managed to shove back the tears that had been welling up in his eyes. Snape didn't comment, for which Harry was grateful. Instead, he spoke in a whisper, talking Harry through the process of clearing his mind. Slowly, Harry's recent stressors began to fade away into the back of his mind, and all he was aware of was Snape's low, soothing voice and the gentle, calming sensation of Snape's hand on his head. Harry drifted off into a deep, untroubled sleep. It was some time after breakfast the following day, and Harry was curled on his chair with a thick book. He'd been pleasantly surprised to find that, today, Snape had allowed him to be in the library unsupervised. "Though he probably has monitoring spells and stuff on me, just in case Harry forced back his irritation at being treated like a child. "I don't want to think about that." Harry had only read a few more pages when he heard the library door open. He looked up quickly to see Snape standing by the doorway. "Am I late for lunch?" Harry asked, glancing up at the clock. Snape shook his head, moving closer. "No, lunch is not for a while yet. I would simply like to speak with you." Harry felt his stomach lurch. This was it. Snape was going to ask him all the questions he couldn't answer, and then he'd have to remember everything. And the worst part was, he couldn't object. "Yes, sir," Harry mumbled, setting down his book and rising to follow Snape out of the room. They entered the sitting room, and Snape pointed Harry toward the couch while he drew up a chair to sit facing Harry. Harry pushed back into the cushions, hunching his shoulders and unconsciously picking at the skin around his cuticles. He jumped slightly when he felt Snape gently pry his fingers apart. He looked up. "This is not an interrogation, Harry." Harry nodded, attempting in vain to relax his shoulders. "I am aware that you would prefer not to speak," Snape said in a low voice. "But we must." The man released Harry's fingers and leaned back into his chair. Harry nodded, biting down on his lip. "I don't want to talk, I don't want to talk, I don't, Harry." "Yes, sir. It is not my intention to cause you discomfort. I will only be asking you what I believe is vital for me to be aware of. If you feel you cannot answer, I will not insist you do so." Harry's stomach unclenched a little. So he wouldn't have to fight to keep certain things to himself. Snape wouldn't insist, but he would try to give the man at least something. He owed that much to him. "Okay," Harry said in a slightly wavering voice. "I'll try. That is all I ask," said Snape quietly. Snape leaned forward in his seat slightly, and Harry forced himself not to shrink back. "Prior to your arrival here, you resided with your aunt, uncle, and cousin." Harry jerked his head in semblance of a nod, eyes on his lap. "If you don't count my year-long jaunt in the streets, how would you describe your relationship with them?" "Not very well." "Why is that?" Harry shrugged. "'Cause they hated my guts and wanted me dead. We just didn't like each other." Snape seemed to want to ask more about that, but he let it go, at least for now. "Can you describe your late uncle for me?" Harry tensed at that. "Large and loud," was all he opted to say. Snape nodded, his face inscrutable. "Did he take charge of discipline in the home?" Harry tensed even further, his breaths quickening. "I don't want to answer that, but I have to say something." "Yes," Harry answered shortly. Harry shifted his gaze from his fingernails to Snape's face. "Can you try to expound upon that?" Snape asked quietly. Do the details really matter? Harry asked tersely. They do. As I am in a position of authority over you, it is absolutely vital that I know how you have been treated in the past, so I can avoid erring in my interactions with you. I fear I have already done so out of ignorance. Harry took a deep, shuddering breath. Could he say anything to Snape? It wasn't as though Vernon's questionable methods of discipline would give the man any ideas. It was clear that Snape didn't want to hurt him. It's obvious he knows, or suspects, that Vernon liked to push me around. It won't change anything if I tell. Harry, Snape pressed. When I messed up, Harry mumbled, the last part of his sentence entirely incoherent. Would you care to repeat that, Mr. Potter? Snape asked, the epitome of patience. No, I would not care to repeat that, actually. Harry felt himself growing unaccountably angry, and he forced himself not to snap at the man. He doesn't deserve that from me. He hit me, Harry muttered, unable to conceal his frustration. Snape closed eyes, sighing heavily, but he did not seem surprised by Harry's grudging revelation. Do you fear that I will do the same to you? Snape asked, his face unreadable again. Harry shook his head. No, not really. Not when he was thinking rationally, at least. When his instincts took over, it was hard to distinguish the man he knew Snape to be from the general image of an imposing, adult male that had been built up in his mind ever since the first time Vernon had taken a swing at him. There was a momentary pause, where Snape seemed to be weighing his words. He inhaled slowly to speak again. For the incident that occurred in the library shortly after your arrival, I feel I have not apologized enough, said Snape, leaning closer to Harry with his hands on his knees. Under any circumstance, my behavior was reprehensible, but in light of what you have just confirmed for me, I cannot. Snape's voice trailed off. It's all right, sir, Harry mumbled. Snape shook his head. No, it most certainly is not. I can assure you, however, that it will not happen again. Harry nodded, chewing on his lip. There was a brief, though tense pause before Snape spoke again. You say you do not fear me, but considering the incident when I ordered you to face the wall, Harry cringed. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Why did I have to go and act all weird? Harry. Harry looked up, realizing that he'd failed to register the rest of Snape's question. He knew what the man was asking, though. It wasn't you, Harry whispered. Snape simply looked on patiently, eyebrows raised, compelling Harry to continue. I just don't like when I can't see who's in the room. I thought you were someone else. Brilliant. How eloquent. I'm sure that explains everything. Harry was relieved to see Snape nod in understanding. I regret forcing you into a situation which frightened you, said Snape, his dark eyes boring into Harry's, willing him to take his words as truth. Harry wanted to be angry at that comment. He wanted to valiantly deny that he had been afraid, that he had ever even been acquainted with the feeling. But it was a lie. He had been terrified. His whole life, really, he had been afraid. Fear was the only emotion Harry hadn't learned to shut away. I don't think you would do what he did. I just wasn't thinking straight, Harry said quietly. Snape nodded slowly. That is relieving to hear. However, I would prefer to avoid causing such reactions in the future, you understand. Yes, sir. Snape leaned back into his chair, steepling his fingers. Did your aunt ever intervene on your behalf? Harry swallowed, and he folded his arms over his chest. He felt as though the room had dropped several degrees. Uncle Vernon had been far more threatening than Petunia, at least, objectively. But Vernon had always been withholding of affection, even with Dudley to some degree. But Petunia had not been, not with Dudley, with whom she showered with affection, and towards whom her gaze was never anything but adoring. But then she'd shift her gaze to Harry, and her face would transform instantly from loving to disgusted, and it made Harry feel far, far colder than in response to anything Vernon had ever done. It felt like despair. Harry shook his head fiercely, his hands trembling. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Harry felt Snape's eyes on him as he tensed further, eyes trained on his knees. You may go. Harry fled to his room to curl up under his bed, wishing for his penknife, wishing for oblivion. But the child was not James Potter. Yes, he looked uncannily like his late father, and he'd clearly inherited his skill on a broomstick as well. But he was Harry, a boy who hadn't let himself be broken, no matter how close he'd come. A child with a keen mind and wit that often took Severus by surprise. His eyes were following the child carefully, wand at the ready lest the child attempt a dangerous maneuver, yet a distant noise still managed to startle him. After a moment, he realized what it was. The child was laughing. Severus felt a rush of warmth in his chest upon hearing it. His actions alone had given the boy a chance to really be a child, if just for a short while. In that moment, any lingering unpleasant thoughts relating to James Potter melted away. The child was happy, and if flying gave him such joy, Severus would not hesitate to allow the child flying time whenever he wished it. Severus watched Harry fly for another long while, a faint smile hovering upon his lips. Eventually, the boy landed, far too forcefully in Severus' opinion, and he was about to say as much when he saw the child's face. Harry was smiling, grinning really, his eyes sparkling, cheeks flushed, and hair windswept. He handed the broomstick to Severus, with the all too rare smile lighting up his face. "Thank you, sir," said Harry breathlessly, brushing his tousled hair out of his eyes. Severus quirked his lips at the child, which had Harry smiling shyly back. "I take it that you have enjoyed that, Mr. Potter," said Severus, his gruff tone hiding his discomfort at the child's obvious gratitude. Harry nodded rapidly, the childlike gesture heartening Severus more than he cared to admit. "Yes, sir, it was incredible. I am glad to hear it. You certainly took to it quite well." The boy looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, but still smiling nonetheless. Severus motioned toward Harry to follow him, and he led the way inside, broomstick in hand. He noticed Harry looking on a bit wistfully as he stored the broomstick in its cupboard, and he turned to face the child in preparation to rectify that. "You will be allowed to make use of the broom again. There is no reason why you should not be." The boy stared, with a more open expression of surprise than Severus had seen on his face before. "Ah, really, sir?" Severus raised his eyebrows at the boy. "Certainly. I did not make that offer for my health. I rarely fly, so for all intents and purposes, the broom is yours to use." Harry swallowed, looking overwhelmed and bit wary. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though unsure of what to say. He fears that I may demand something of him in return, Severus realized, feeling a surge of fury at those who had damaged the child so. He was sure not to let his feelings show as not to alarm the boy. "It causes me no trouble to grant you use of the broom. All I expect of you is to exercise caution in all your behaviors," he said pointedly. He felt heartless when the boy flushed and looked away at his statement. It had to be said. Regardless of a short respite, the boy is still struggling greatly. "Yes, sir," Harry mumbled. "Good," said Severus. "Come join me in the lab before lunch if you would." Severus set the boy to brew an altered version of the calming draught, which was designed to produce a more subtle calming effect than the original formulation and was simpler to brew, keeping a sharp eye on him all the while. "I will have to speak with him later. It will upset him, surely, to discuss his past, but it is necessary. I simply must be sure to question him in the correct manner. I may lose him altogether if I push too hard." I can't believe he did that for me, Harry thought as he mashed his beetle eyes. He knew I'd like flying, and I didn't even have to ask. He just gave it to me for free. He gives me everything for free, and he teaches me potions just because he knows I enjoy it, even though it's probably an inconvenience for him. Harry wondered if potions were invented regularly, and if Snape had ever done it. Just ask him, no reason not to. He's answered my questions before. Harry looked up from his beetle eyes towards Snape discreetly. It seemed that the man had paused to allow his potion to simmer and was brushing a stray clump of hair out of his face. "Sir?" Harry asked tentatively. Snape looked up, eyebrows raised. "Yes. Have you ever invented any potions?" "Certainly." "What have you invented? When did you start?" How Snape let out a huff of breath that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. "I began experimenting in my youth," he began, looking a bit amused, as though in reminiscence of past events. "What did you invent then, sir?" "I was a rather vengeful young man, so I set out to exact revenge upon certain individuals who I felt had wronged me. I therefore created a potion meant to induce uncontrollable laughter in the drinker." Harry bit back a laugh. "Did it work?" "Seeing that it landed 6 individuals in the hospital wing, I do believe it did." Harry's lips twitched. "Any others?" Snape looked thoughtful. "I do recall one other meant to induce severe indigestion." "I assume that worked as well, sir?" Harry asked, unable to force back a grin at the thought of what that might entail. Snape smirked. "I was rather fortunate not to be implicated, considering the fallout. He's way too good at this to just teach. You do more than teach potions, don't you?" "Astute observation, Mr. Potter. Was that a yes?" Harry looked at Snape inquiringly. Do you develop potions now? Snape nodded, an intent expression on his face. For many years I have been in correspondence with several potioneers like myself, developing new or improving existing brews. That is such a cool job. I wonder why he teaches. That's probably too personal. I can't ask. What sort of potions have you worked on? Snape paused as he took a moment to raise the flame beneath his cauldron. Recently, I have been in correspondence with a colleague to develop what we've named the adrenaline draft, designed to aid in combating severe allergic reactions, particularly in children. He paused, fiddling with the temperature. Additionally, for the greater part of 6 years, I and several others have been involved in extensive research on the development of the wolfsbane potion, which has been perfected only very recently. What's the wolfsbane potion? Harry asked, interestedly. Snape finished stabilizing the heat and looked up again. You are aware that werewolves do indeed exist. Harry nodded. In fact, he'd been quite interested to learn that many mythical creatures he had heard of growing up did exist. The wolfsbane potion allows the drinker to keep their human mind upon the transformation. How does it work? In the brain, I mean. Snape looked a bit surprised at the question. He studied Harry carefully for a moment, his gaze unusually soft. Harry lowered his eyes, unsure of what was expected of him. He was relieved when Snape spoke again. Werewolves, at the time they are bitten, rapidly develop an entirely animalistic area of their brains, which is brought to the forefront at the time of transformation, and on a lesser scale, when the subject loses control of their emotions while in human form. Harry nodded, forgetting entirely about his potion, which was due to be stirred again. The wolfsbane potion, as a result of the interaction of its various ingredients, primarily inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. You are aware of its mechanics, Mr. Potter. Harry nodded. In primary school, he'd once snuck over to the neighboring high school to hide from Dudley and his gang, and he'd found an anatomy textbook in the deserted science classroom. He'd read that a hormone called adrenaline activated the fight or flight reaction in response to perceived danger, and in that moment, a person was driven by pure instinct, animal instinct. Incidentally, it had explained quite a bit about why Harry often felt strangely panicky at seemingly random times. Mr. Potter, your potion, Snape warned. Harry looked up quickly. He'd left it simmering for far too long, so it was bubbling madly, and the color had darkened considerably. He quickly turned off the flame, stirring rapidly. Once the bubbling had slowed, Harry looked up nervously at Snape. Was he annoyed that Harry had messed up? Snape seemed quite unconcerned. A handful of mint leaves will suffice as a cooling agent. Harry nodded quickly, obeying, and he was relieved to see that the potion paled and thickened slightly, as it was meant to. Bottle the potion, Mr. Potter. I believe we can continue our conversation upstairs. It's time for lunch. Harry did so, then followed Snape upstairs to the kitchen for lunch. Once seated, Harry looked up, eager to continue their conversation. Snape swallowed a bite of food. Ah, yes, we were discussing the impact of the wolfsbane potion on the sympathetic nervous system. Snape paused to take a swallow of water from his glass. A chemical messenger, acetylcholine, stimulates the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline. You are aware of what those are? Yes, sir. They're the fight or flight hormones. Correct. The wolfsbane potion inhibits the release of acetylcholine, thereby preventing the release of said hormones, which in turn inhibits the sympathetic nervous system. You understand why such a process would allow a werewolf to retain their human mind. Harry chewed his lip. I suppose the sympathetic nervous system is very active during transformations, and the new area of their brain is activated. Very good. A thought occurred to Harry just then. What would happen if a non-werewolf took the potion? Snape raised his eyebrows. A purely hypothetical query, I hope. Harry nodded quickly, suppressing a smile. Should a non-lycanthrope ingest even a small amount of the wolfsbane potion, it would send them into a deep coma from which they may never wake, and would certainly permanently damage their nervous system, even if they did. I guess that would happen because the potion needs to be really powerful in order to overcome the wolf brain, so a human brain would be completely overwhelmed by it. Have you worked on any other potions, sir? Harry asked. As you have not yet begun to eat, I believe we can continue this conversation at a later point in time. Harry nodded reluctantly, realizing that he hadn't yet even served himself. He ate quickly, all the while itching to go to the library to research more on the topic they'd been discussing. The rest of the day continued at a surprisingly calming pace. Harry spent some more time in the lab, discussing Snape's potions work, though Harry took care to pay more attention to his potion while doing so. Later on, Harry joined Snape in his office to read for a while, as Snape did not want to leave Harry on his own. Harry didn't object, though it made him feel like an invalid. He continually reminded himself not to feel resentful of the arrangement. I did it to myself, Harry told himself firmly. It's not as though he wants me underfoot at all hours of the day, he's just doing what he has to. I have no right to complain. Despite his inner tirade, Harry couldn't help shifting in his seat, feeling crowded and irritated. It was hard to relax with a book when shut in a small room with another person, even if it was Snape. Every sound seemed amplified, as it often did when Harry felt anxious. The scratching of Snape's quill sounded like nails raking down a blackboard, and even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt jarring. Harry ground his teeth and loosened his grip on his book, allowing it to fall unceremoniously to the floor. He winced at the sound. Snape looked up at the noise, one eyebrow raised. "Sorry, sir," Harry said quickly. "I didn't mean to. I take it you've had enough, Mr. Potter." Snape interjected, not seeming particularly annoyed. Harry nodded, unconsciously rubbing at his eyes. "I think it's time you prepared for bed. I had not noticed the time." Harry immediately tensed at that. "I can't go to bed. I'll have nightmares. I don't want to sleep. I don't want to think." "Harry." Harry looked up, noticing that he'd clutched his arms around his chest and was rocking back and forth in his chair slightly. He stopped moving, feeling foolish. "You cannot take a potion tonight," Snape said slowly. "However, I will assist you with clearing your mind." He cleared off his desk with a quick wave of his wand, rising from his seat. "Come." Harry rose jerkily from his seat, picking up the book he'd dropped and storing it on its shelf. He then followed Snape upstairs, feeling an odd sense of déjà vu. At least Snape wasn't half carrying him upstairs this time. When they reached Harry's room, Snape sat on the chair near the wall, while Harry gathered up his pajamas to change in the bathroom. He emerged a few moments later, teeth brushed and pajama-clad. He climbed into bed, any residual good feelings from the surprisingly enjoyable day he'd quickly evaporating. Harry hunched a little when Snape walked over. He wasn't a little kid. He didn't need to be put to bed. Even when he had been a toddler, no one had ever put him to bed. Snape seemed to disregard Harry's embarrassment and pushed him back into his pillows. "There is no shame in accepting help, Harry," said Snape quietly, backing up a few feet. Harry looked down, a tight feeling in his throat. "Why do I keep feeling like I want to cry? I don't." Harry felt Snape draw a bit closer, reaching out a hand to rest on the back of his head. He leaned unconsciously into the touch, flitting his eyes away when he felt them burn. Taking a slow, deep breath, Harry managed to shove back the tears that had been welling up in his eyes. Snape didn't comment, for which Harry was grateful. Instead, he spoke in a whisper, talking Harry through the process of clearing his mind. Slowly, Harry's recent stressors began to fade away into the back of his mind, and all he was aware of was Snape's low, soothing voice and the gentle, calming sensation of Snape's hand on his head. Harry drifted off into a deep, untroubled sleep. It was some time after breakfast the following day, and Harry was curled on his chair with a thick book. He'd been pleasantly surprised to find that, today, Snape had allowed him to be in the library unsupervised. Though he probably has monitoring spells and stuff on me, just in case Harry forced back his irritation at being treated like a child. "I don't want to think about that." Harry had only read a few more pages when he heard the library door open. He looked up quickly to see Snape standing by the doorway. "Am I late for lunch?" Harry asked, glancing up at the clock. Snape shook his head, moving closer. "No, lunch is not for a while yet. I would simply like to speak with you." Harry felt his stomach lurch. This was it. Snape was going to ask him all the questions he couldn't answer, and then he'd have to remember everything. And the worst part was, he couldn't object. "Yes, sir," Harry mumbled, setting down his book and rising to follow Snape out of the room. They entered the sitting room, and Snape pointed Harry toward the couch while he drew up a chair to sit facing Harry. Harry pushed back into the cushions, hunching his shoulders and unconsciously picking at the skin around his cuticles. He jumped slightly when he felt Snape gently pry his fingers apart. He looked up. "This is not an interrogation, Harry." Harry nodded, attempting in vain to relax his shoulders. I am aware that you would prefer not to speak, Snape said in a low voice, but we must. The man released Harry's fingers and leaned back into his chair. Harry nodded, biting down on his lip. I don't want to talk, I don't want to talk, I don't, Harry. Yes, sir. It is not my intention to cause you discomfort. I will only be asking you what I believe is vital for me to be aware of. If you feel you cannot answer, I will not insist you do so. Harry's stomach unclenched a little. So he wouldn't have to fight to keep certain things to himself. Snape wouldn't insist, but he would try to give the man at least something. He owed that much to him. Okay, Harry said in a slightly wavering voice. I'll try. That is all I ask, said Snape quietly. Snape leaned forward in his seat slightly, and Harry forced himself not to shrink back. Prior to your arrival here, you resided with your aunt, uncle, and cousin. Harry jerked his head in semblance of a nod, eyes on his lap. If you don't count my year-long jaunt in the streets, how would you describe your relationship with them? Not very well. Why is that? Harry shrugged. 'Cause they hated my guts and wanted me dead. We just didn't like each other. Snape seemed to want to ask more about that, but he let it go, at least for now. Can you describe your late uncle for me? Harry tensed at that. Large and loud, was all he opted to say. Snape nodded, his face inscrutable. Did he take charge of discipline in the home? Harry tensed even further, his breaths quickening. I don't want to answer that, but I have to say something. Yes, Harry answered shortly. Harry shifted his gaze from his fingernails to Snape's face. Can you try to expound upon that? Snape asked quietly. Do the details really matter? Harry asked tersely. They do. As I am in a position of authority over you, it is absolutely vital that I know how you have been treated in the past, so I can avoid erring in my interactions with you. I fear I have already done so out of ignorance. Harry took a deep, shuddering breath. Could he say anything to Snape? It wasn't as though Vernon's questionable methods of discipline would give the man any ideas. It was clear that Snape didn't want to hurt him. It's obvious he knows, or suspects, that Vernon liked to push me around. It won't change anything if I tell. Harry, Snape pressed. When I messed up, Harry mumbled, the last part of his sentence entirely incoherent. Would you care to repeat that, Mr. Potter? Snape asked, the epitome of patience. No, I would not care to repeat that, actually. Harry felt himself growing unaccountably angry, and he forced himself not to snap at the man. He doesn't deserve that from me. He hit me, Harry muttered, unable to conceal his frustration. Snape closed eyes, sighing heavily, but he did not seem surprised by Harry's grudging revelation. Do you fear that I will do the same to you? Snape asked, his face unreadable again. Harry shook his head. No, not really. Not when he was thinking rationally, at least. When his instincts took over, it was hard to distinguish the man he knew Snape to be from the general image of an imposing, adult male that had been built up in his mind ever since the first time Vernon had taken a swing at him. There was a momentary pause, where Snape seemed to be weighing his words. He inhaled slowly to speak again. For the incident that occurred in the library shortly after your arrival, I feel I have not apologized enough, said Snape, leaning closer to Harry with his hands on his knees. Under any circumstance, my behavior was reprehensible, but in light of what you have just confirmed for me, I cannot. Snape's voice trailed off. It's all right, sir, Harry mumbled. Snape shook his head. No, it most certainly is not. I can assure you, however, that it will not happen again. Harry nodded, chewing on his lip. There was a brief, though tense pause before Snape spoke again. You say you do not fear me, but considering the incident when I ordered you to face the wall, Harry cringed. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Why did I have to go and act all weird? Harry. Harry looked up, realizing that he'd failed to register the rest of Snape's question. He knew what the man was asking, though. It wasn't you, Harry whispered. Snape simply looked on patiently, eyebrows raised, compelling Harry to continue. I just don't like when I can't see who's in the room. I thought you were someone else. Brilliant. How eloquent. I'm sure that explains everything. Harry was relieved to see Snape nod in understanding. I regret forcing you into a situation which frightened you, said Snape, his dark eyes boring into Harry's, willing him to take his words as truth. Harry wanted to be angry at that comment. He wanted to valiantly deny that he had been afraid, that he had ever even been acquainted with the feeling. But it was a lie. He had been terrified. His whole life, really, he had been afraid. Fear was the only emotion Harry hadn't learned to shut away. I don't think you would do what he did. I just wasn't thinking straight, Harry said quietly. Snape nodded slowly. That is relieving to hear. However, I would prefer to avoid causing such reactions in the future, you understand? Yes, sir. Snape leaned back into his chair, steepling his fingers. Did your aunt ever intervene on your behalf? Harry swallowed, and he folded his arms over his chest. He felt as though the room had dropped several degrees. Uncle Vernon had been far more threatening than Petunia, at least, objectively. But Vernon had always been withholding of affection, even with Dudley to some degree. But Petunia had not been, not with Dudley, with whom she showered with affection, and towards whom her gaze was never anything but adoring. But then she'd shift her gaze to Harry, and her face would transform instantly from loving to disgusted, and it made Harry feel far, far colder than in response to anything Vernon had ever done. It felt like despair. Harry, Harry shook his head fiercely, his hands trembling. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Harry felt Snape's eyes on him as he tensed further, eyes trained on his knees. You may go. Harry fled to his room to curl up under his bed, wishing for his penknife, wishing for oblivion. Chapter 15. Still Living. Chapter text. Harry and Snape were at the breakfast table when their companionable silence was broken by a loud pop, and a large, reddish-brown owl materialized with an envelope tied to its leg. Harry could do nothing but stare. Ah, that must be your Hogwarts acceptance letter, said Snape, setting down his fork. He reached out to untie the letter from the owl's leg, which then promptly vanished with another pop. A rush of anxious excitement rose up in Harry's chest. He was really going to Hogwarts. At first it had seemed like a fantastical sort of dream, and later on, when he'd decided to, well, he convinced himself that he didn't want to go anyway. But now he did. Why did the owl appear like that? Harry asked, reaching for the letter from Snape's proffered hand. The enchantment surrounding the property prevents owls from flying in. Professor Dumbledore is aware of that, so it seems he made other arrangements. Harry nodded his understanding as he carefully opened the envelope, feeling a brief jolt of anger that arose at the mention of Dumbledore. He shoved the feeling aside as he eagerly unfolded the letter. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, CHF, Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Conft. Of Wizards, dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on 1 September. We await your owl by no later than 31 July. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Deputy Headmistress Harry scanned the supply list with wide eyes. Robes, cauldron, wand, this was insane, and completely amazing. He read through the acceptance letter again, turning the thick, yellowish parchment in his hands. Parchment, what century are these people living in? A thought suddenly occurred to Harry, and it felt as though a bucket of ice-cold water had been dumped on his head. How was he supposed to pay for all of this? That's it then. I can't go. I can't pay for supplies, not to mention tuition, which is probably really expensive. What had he expected? What had Snape expected? Why would he act as though Harry attending Hogwarts was a given when the man had to know that Harry had no money of his own? It wasn't as though Snape was going to cover the expense. Harry swallowed. I don't have any money, sir, he said quietly. There was a slight pause. Mr. Potter. Harry looked up to see Snape peering at him oddly. Surely, you, Snape's voice trailed off. Nonplussed, Harry waited for Snape to continue, confusion temporarily overcoming the bitter disappointment that he couldn't quite shove away. Snape cleared his throat. Harry, you have inherited a considerable sum of money from your father, who was descended from a long line of well-to-do wizards. Harry stared. That can't be, he said flatly. I assure you, I am not mistaken. Something in Snape's voice convinced Harry that it was true. The man had never lied to him, at least as far as he knew, and in any case, why would Snape lie about this? Harry stared at a discolored spot on the wall, his lips pressed together firmly. He had money. He was actually rich. He'd been told all his life what a financial burden he was, and that everything he was given was far more than he deserved, while he'd had piles of money waiting for him somewhere. I could have bought my own house. I could have done anything, gone anywhere. I could have gotten Jade and me out of hell, all of that for nothing. Harry, Snape cut into Harry's internal diatribe, eyebrows raised in askance. It's nothing, Harry muttered. I never knew I had money. Snape nodded in understanding. I imagine it must be something of a shock. Snape's matter-of-fact tone was enough to quell Harry's sudden emotional upheaval, if not subdue it completely. Fine. So I was rich all this time, and I didn't know. Get over it, at least I have a way to pay for school. It's a good thing. Do wizards have banks? Harry asked quickly. Snape nodded. Yes, the largest one by far is called Gringotts, which is run by goblins. Goblins? What in the? I gather that you are surprised to learn of that, Snape said, looking amused. Harry opened his mouth, then closed it, shrugging. I don't know why I still get surprised by things like this. Snape studied him for a moment. If you are amenable, I will escort you to Diagon Alley, the nearest wizarding shopping area, as Muggles would refer to it, later this week. Harry nodded. Yes, sir, thank you. It is no trouble, said Snape, waving a dismissive hand as he cleared the table with the wand in his other. Now go fetch the broomstick. Harry's eyes widened, momentarily forgetting his upset. Ah, really, sir? Did I not tell you that you may fly again? Said Snape, exasperated. Why, yes, sir, I just didn't. Harry trailed off. Snape closed his eyes briefly. You did not believe me. The man rose from his seat briskly, brushing some imaginary crumbs from his robes as he strode towards the door. For Merlin's sake, don't dawdle. Harry jumped slightly, then hurriedly fetched the broom and followed Snape outside. It's strange how differently I feel while I'm flying, Harry thought, curled up in the library some time later. And as soon as I land, it's back to normal. The bad normal. If I could just live my whole life flying, I would be fine. But no, I have to stay down here and put up with everything. Harry groaned in agitation as he closed his book. He couldn't sit here anymore. He didn't want to do anything, really, except fly. But Snape had made it quite clear that he wasn't allowed to fly without supervision, and the man was obviously too busy to supervise him. If I could just grab the broom, and no way, he'd kill me. Or, at least, never let me fly again. Harry stood up abruptly and made for the door. If he sat here for one moment longer, he might just pull his hair out. I'll go outside, then. He never said I couldn't. But of course, as soon as he reached the doorway, he heard footsteps. Harry turned quickly to see Snape striding toward him. Is he angry? How did he even know? The stupid monitors, that's how. Why isn't he saying anything? I just wanted to go outside, sir, Harry said, careful to keep his frustration out of his voice. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, refusing to avert his gaze as Snape stared at him, as though he were an interesting breed of beetle that he'd just procured for use in one of his more obscure potions. Perhaps you'd like to join me for a stroll, Mr. Potter, Snape finally said. Well, that took the winds right out of Harry's sails. Join him for a stroll. All right. Good, Snape nodded, opening the door, and Harry followed him, a bit bemusedly. Air had cooled significantly since Harry's flying session earlier in the day, and a breeze tousled Harry's hair, a sensation that felt oddly soothing. Harry walked alongside Snape in silence for several moments, allowing the fresh air to calm him. It wasn't like flying, but it was definitely preferable to being shut inside. I'm taking a stroll with Snape. That's extremely normal. Snape is absolutely a person I'd picture as a stroll taker. Harry, said Snape, pausing where he stood. Harry looked up warily. Yes, sir, Snape inhaled, straightening the cuffs of his sleeve. I do understand that it is very difficult for you to speak with me about topics concerning your history. Harry clenched his fists, staring at the ground. So this was why they were taking a so-called stroll. It should have been obvious. Therefore, Snape continued, tapping Harry's shoulder to make him look up, I propose to offer you an incentive, so to speak. An incentive? Well, that was interesting. I will make time in my schedule to supervise your flying more frequently if you make a reasonable effort to answer my questions. Harry narrowed his eyes. How frequently, sir? Snape's eyes glimmered with amusement. That would depend on how many questions are answered. Harry thought for a moment. This could be worth it. I'm losing my mind, staying inside. But what if I can't answer certain questions? Then I will attempt to steer the topic in a direction in which you feel more comfortable, Snape replied smoothly. I will still allow you flying time even if you cannot answer any, as I said I would do originally. Yet if you do answer my questions, you will simply have more flying time. And if I say no? Harry asked daringly. He needed to know all sides of this negotiation. It was only good business. Snape's lips twitched. I would not force you to do so. However, I would be unable to allow you your independence for an extended period of time, as I would have no way of knowing how you are faring. This isn't really a deal. It's more of a reward system. If I agree, I get more flying time. If I don't, I won't be allowed anywhere alone. I suppose he doesn't have to offer a reward, but he's trying to make it easier for me. Nice of him, I suppose. I'll accept, sir, Harry said finally. Snape inclined his head. Very well. He drew in a breath. Now, if you make an effort at present, I will supervise your flying after dinner. Yes, sir, Harry said, chewing on his lip. Just deal with it. It's just questions, it's just talking. It can't hurt me. Yet he could not prevent the cold fear from gripping at his chest. It'll go away when I fly. It's fine. Harry squared his shoulders. He could handle it. He wasn't scared. He looked up when Snape cleared his throat. I will reiterate, this is not an interrogation. If you feel uncomfortable, I will not push you. Yes, sir, Harry muttered. He walked alongside Snape reluctantly for several moments more, bracing himself for the coming onslaught. Can you describe for me your relationship with your late aunt? Snape asked in a low voice, slowing his pace slightly. Harry swallowed thickly. Non-existent, he said stiffly. How so? We ignored each other unless she was giving me an order. Such as chores. What sort of chores did she have you do? Cooking, cleaning, garden work, stuff like that. Harry kicked a stray rock, watching as it rolled steadily down the slight incline of the walkway. Interesting, he wouldn't have noticed the incline at all otherwise. How much time was your day spent on performing chores on average? Harry jerked his head up. Dunno, a while. Snape paused in his questioning for a moment, while Harry exhaled slowly, trying to ease the tension in his shoulders. His muscles immediately tensed again when Snape spoke. What of? Recreation. Did you spend time with other children of your age? Harry was eternally grateful that he was walking beside Snape instead of sitting across from him. This way the man could not see his expression. I didn't get on with the kids at school. I'm not talking about Jade. No, why is that? They thought I was strange. If Dudley hadn't already scared them off. Why do you believe that they thought you strange? Because I wasn't like them. How so? Dunno. I didn't talk much in school. Your linguistic abilities were too advanced for them to comprehend, perhaps. Harry sort of smiled. Something like that. Is that all? Harry chewed on the inside of his lower lip. This wasn't even the hard stuff to talk about, it was just embarrassing. He forced himself to say something anyway. The more he spoke about the easy things, the more leeway he'd have to avoid talking about everything else. I don't know how to talk to people. I never know what to say. It is understandable, Snape said after a moment. Was it? Harry shrugged listlessly. I didn't care, and I still don't. You had a cousin your age, did you not? Harry nodded jerkily. We didn't get on either. There was a momentary pause where Snape seemed to be weighing his words. Harry walked on in silence, kicking at more stones that came across his path. Was your cousin given chores as well? Snape asked, smoothing the front of his cloak, which had been blown astray by the breeze. Harry snorted. Dudley chores, that's a good one. No, he said flatly, masking the odd feeling that was rising up in his chest. Dudley's dead. He was 10 and he died. He didn't deserve to die. But I don't feel particularly bad either. Does that make me a bad person for not caring? Harry, Snape prompted. He's dead, Harry whispered without meaning to. Snape sighed, then made a stifled movement as though he was going to grasp Harry's shoulder but thought better of it. Good. He didn't deserve comfort, not when he didn't care that a kid he'd known had died. He's dead, and I don't even care, he bit out, his voice purposefully cold, but not quite hiding the tremor beneath it. Harry forced himself to look up. Snape's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were focused upon Harry's steadily, not seeming disgusted by Harry's revelation. Snape stopped where he stood, reaching out slowly to grip Harry's shoulder, keeping him in place. Harry didn't resist. You did not have a positive relationship with him, nor with any of your relatives. Your response is in no way unusual, he said firmly. Harry shrugged, looking away. Are we done? He whispered, feeling spent. If you wish, Snape replied, turning to walk back towards the house. Harry followed, relieved. Dinner is in an hour. I will supervise your flying after. Yes, sir. Harry sat in the library, attempting to piece together his thoughts. The scattered, confused, irritating thoughts that had been plaguing him since yesterday, when Snape had to go and bring up the Dursleys. Do I care at all that he died? If I didn't, I wouldn't even be thinking about it. Proof is I'm not thinking about Vernon, 'cause I'm glad he's dead. That way I'm safe, from him at least. Petunia, I don't know. She probably wouldn't have cared if I died. But Dudley was just a kid, even if he was an enormous prat. He didn't really do anything to me. Harry rubbed his eyes, worn out. A thought suddenly occurred to him. He was my age and he died. I was supposed to die. He had everything he wanted. Parents who loved him. Money, toys, friends. It would have been worth it for him to live. Not me, though. So why did I live while he died? But had Dudley really had everything he wanted? Harry thought back. Harry was 9. It was another hot afternoon, and Harry had been ordered to paint the garden fence, never mind that he'd done it just 4 days ago. He figured Petunia just wanted him out of the house. He didn't mind. It was always better to be outside, even in the heat of the day. Harry shifted slightly when he heard the familiar shuffle of Dudley's heavy tread. He braced himself for an onslaught of juvenile insults, but instead he heard a sniffle. Dudley was crying. Real tears this time, not one of the fake tantrums he threw almost daily. Harry shrugged to himself and continued with his work. This Dudley was no threat, but somehow he was more difficult to ignore. You're lucky, you know. Harry turned his head quickly at that. Lucky, him, that was rich coming from Dudley. Have you been sniffing glue? Harry asked, eyebrows raised. Dudley lifted his head, bloodshot eyes glistening with tears. Harry's comment seemed to fly over his head. Dad doesn't care what you do. For me, I have to, I dunno, do everything he does, or else he'll hate me too. Wouldn't do to you what he does to me, Harry told him flatly. Dudley squinted at him. Maybe he would. He doesn't like you, so he hits you, so if he didn't like me, he'd hit me too. Harry rolled his eyes inwardly at Dudley's logic. But you're his kid. It's different, he responded impatiently, turning back to the fence. That doesn't matter. There are already things he wouldn't like about me if he knew, and he'd try to squash it out of me like he does you. Harry stared at Dudley. Trouble in paradise. Who knew? How does that make me lucky? Harry asked, honestly wanting to know. At that moment, Dudley's small, blue eyes seemed to harden with a rarely seen spark of maturity. Because you know what to expect. As Harry mulled that over, the door banged open and both he and Dudley jumped. Get back to that painting, boy, Vernon bellowed. If you don't have that done in an hour, Dudley, what are you doing over there? Harry turned quickly back to the fence, and Dudley shoved him to the ground, paint splattering everywhere. Harry closed his eyes. He didn't want to think about it. Eyes still squeezed shut, he grabbed blindly at the nearest book from the pile on the table, which turned out to be a volume on magical creatures. He flipped it open randomly, needing to focus his thoughts on something else. He skimmed through the pages quickly. Boggarts, odd creatures. How is it possible that they can detect what a person's worst fear is? What was the purpose of such a creature? Did it really do any good for anyone to face their worst fear if it wasn't even real? What would a boggart turn into for me? And how can it know what my worst fear is when I'm not even sure myself? What was his worst fear? There were many things that could qualify, but did one stand out above the others? Do I even want to know? I wonder what it would have turned into for Dudley, probably Vernon hating him like he hated me. Wanting to hurt him like stop, just stop. Harry shut the book with a loud snap, his mood rapidly plummeting. I can't do this. I can't. Harry curled up into a tight ball, palms pressed against his face. His heart beat sporadically as he rocked back and forth. He could feel himself shaking. No, no, I need. Clenching his hands into fists to stop them from trembling, Harry stood up, slipping outdoors as silently as he could. It was drizzling lightly, and the damp grass flattened beneath his feet as he walked. Uncurling his fingers to collect the raindrops, Harry paused where he stood. He searched the ground for some small object, anything, and spotted a few stray rocks. Leaning down, he grabbed the smallest one and set it down on the ground apart from the others. He focused carefully on it, as though trying to physically shove his stress straight into it. Only intending to make it hover in the air, he jerked back in shock when the stone, after rising a few inches into the air, shattered entirely. I just shattered a stone. I must have been more stressed than I thought. Okay, that works too, I guess. Now let's see if I can do that again. Harry focused whatever energy he had remaining on another stone, but instead sent it flying into a nearby tree. He watched with interest as it bounced off the trunk and landed, partially concealed, into the wet grass. Harry jumped and spun around when the door banged open. Snape exited the house, face tight, as though expecting the worst. Monitors, stupid things. What good are they if they can't tell the difference between a knife and a rock? Harry watched warily as Snape took in the scene, eyes traveling from Harry, who was breathing hard, to the shattered bits of stone scattered across the grass. The lines on the man's face loosened slightly. Harry then noticed that Snape was clutching a cauldron stirrer, pale grey potion, residue dripping from it. Snape sighed with exasperation. Come with me. I need a good hour to complete this potion without the threat of my imminent demise by heart failure. Chapter 16. A Detour. Chapter text. Harry stared skeptically into the jar of white powder that Snape had handed him. He was supposed to toss this powder into the fire and stand in it, as if there was nothing life-threatening about that. I assure you, Mr. Potter, Snape said, sounding impatient. The Floo network is one of the most mainstream magical methods of travel in existence. You have nothing to be concerned about. Harry just looked up at Snape warily, refusing to take a step closer to the ominous-looking flames. Sure, he'd read about the Floo, but actually using it was an entirely different story. Though he had seen Dumbledore use it, he wouldn't put it past the man to have orchestrated the entire event for some incomprehensible reason. Death by fire is probably the worst way. Harry swallowed hard, glaring at the fire distrustfully. If I use it first, will you trust its safety? Snape offered, albeit exasperatedly. He didn't seem angry, though, which was enough for Harry to slowly exhale, then nod, thrusting the jar in the man's direction. Snape grasped it, plucking a pinch of powder from the jar before setting it back on the mantel. He then tossed the powder into the fire, which immediately turned bright green, and Harry backed up slightly as Snape stepped into the fireplace. Diagon Alley, the man said clearly, and he disappeared in a flash of green flame. Okay, he didn't burn up, apparently. So I just do what he did. Right, this is insane. Harry shrugged, then pinched a bit of Floo powder from the jar. He tossed it into the flames, which had since returned to their normal state, and they glowed green yet again. Here goes nothing. Harry took a deep breath, then stuck the toe of his shoe into the fire. When it didn't appear to be consumed, he stepped into the fireplace, half-braced for unbearable heat and horrible pain. Was pleasantly surprised to find that the flames felt like little more than a warm breeze. I won't even bother to try and figure out how this makes any sort of sense. Harry opened his mouth to state his destination and accidentally knocked his heel against one of the burning logs. He abruptly inhaled a mouthful of ash. Diagon Olai, Harry choked out, his lungs desperately attempting to expel the ash. I'm screwed, was Harry's last thought as he was whisked away into a blur of flame and bricks. Harry coughed violently as he rolled out of the fireplace, landing flat on his face in a strange, darkened room. There was no sign of Snape. He pulled himself slowly to his feet, trying to shake off the dizziness and nausea. He swallowed back the rising anxiety. Look at this logically. Obviously, I didn't say Diagon Alley clearly enough, which is why I'm not there, but what I said sounded mostly like it, so I'm probably somewhere nearby. Harry studied his surroundings carefully. It appeared that he had landed in some sort of antique shop. There were odd-looking devices displayed on dusty shelves and tables, and though the room was still and quiet, Harry could sense the subtle magical influences at play. He felt a bit tempted to fiddle with some of the objects, but he abstained. Yeah, brilliant idea. Go touch creepy magical devices and see what happens. Best possible way to get myself turned into a toad. Harry inhaled sharply when he heard the door of the shop open with a ring. He backed carefully toward the far corner of the room, concealing himself behind some very tall stacks of untitled books, holding his breath. Ah, Lucius, Harry heard a gravelly, hoarse voice say. I didn't know wizards smoked, too, and Lucius. Did I just walk into a Shakespearean novel? A pleasure. There was a faint rustle, which Harry assumed was the sound of sleeves brushing together as the men shook hands. I have come to see about acquiring the final products of my collection, if I may, Mr. Burke, said a high, aristocratic voice. I believe that can be arranged. Harry heard footsteps growing steadily louder, and he pushed back more firmly into his corner. Touch nothing, Draco, the aristocratic man, Lucius, said sharply. Harry heard the faint tread of lightweight footsteps, and he realized that he was not the only child in the room. Unable to help himself, he shifted over slightly as to partially unblock his view, and he saw the backs of two men leaning over something on the desk in front of them, one slight and dark-haired, the other tall and thin with long, white blonde hair. A similarly blonde-haired boy who looked to be about Harry's age was examining a rather garish piece of jewelry with his hands clasped behind his back, a sullen expression on his face. I suppose he's Draco, the aristocrat's son. What sort of name is that? Were his parents intentionally trying to make him the target of ridicule? The boy suddenly looked up, and Harry could only stand there, frozen in place, when their eyes met. Severus stepped neatly out of the fireplace of the leaky cauldron, brushing soot off his robes. Ignoring the other occupants of the pub, he stepped to the side, waiting for Harry to come through. As his wait crept slowly from 2 minutes to 3, then 5, it became increasingly obvious that he'd made a profoundly imbecilic error in judgment in assuming the boy would successfully manage his first Floo trip on his own. Considering his maturity, it is so easy to forget how inexperienced he is with the wizarding world. I cannot afford to make such mistakes. I must examine the monitors to locate the boy, though they will likely prove to be useless, as they were not designed to function in locations outside of the property, due to my utter idiocy. Severus waved his wand in a sequence of complex motions, his fears proving to be correct. He could not locate the child from where he was. The monitors are tied to the property. I must return there to adjust them. Seeing that it was his only viable option, Severus shoved a nut into the slot near the jar of Floo powder, grabbed a pinch, and was spinning through chimneys within seconds, all the while cursing the time he'd wasted, as well as the anti-apparition wards on his home, which preventing him from arriving faster. How could he have let the boy out of his sight? He was well aware of the risks, and he knew, quite acutely, what the boy was going through. Child could run into anything, he could get snatched off the streets, even run away. The boy was far too clever for his own good, and a danger to himself. Harry stared into the boy Draco's grey eyes, unsure if he should remain where he was, run, or throw something. The blonde-haired boy's eyes darted toward the adults, then back to Harry. "Draco!" Lucius suddenly called out. Draco jumped, turning quickly to face the other end of the room. "Yes, father," he drawled, the very picture of well-bred propriety. "Mr. Burke and I will be going to the storeroom for several moments. Can I trust you to remain here alone?" Lucius asked sternly. "Yes, father." Harry heard the two men's footsteps growing faint, and the boy turned back to face Harry's corner. "One would think I had planned for that," Draco muttered, shifting away some of the books concealing Harry. "What am I so afraid of? He's just a kid like me. He isn't even much bigger than me." Harry stepped out from behind the stacks of books, forcing an indifferent expression on his face. "And who might you be?" the boy asked, with the air of a person well accustomed to receiving answers. Harry set his jaw. "What's it to you?" "My father practically owns this shop," Draco huffed. "Having the place infested with street urchins does nothing for business." Harry knew he was supposed to be affronted, but he just felt amused. "Did your dad feed you that line, or do you come up with pretentious one-liners on demand?" Harry hadn't known a face could change color so quickly. The boy's pale face darkened red with anger at a speed akin to a traffic light. "Do you know who I am?" the boy asked with a poor attempt at snobbery, nose in the air. Harry just raised his eyebrows, his facial expression speaking for itself. "I suppose that's unsurprising," Draco sniffed, "considering your obviously uncultured upbringing. One cannot expect those of lesser status to be well versed in the names and faces of higher society." Harry couldn't help it. He snorted. "Is something funny?" Draco sniped. Harry rolled his eyes. "The fact that you seem to be under the impression that you represent this so-called higher society, perhaps." Draco squared his shoulders. "Well, I imagine you wouldn't qualify for acceptance to Hogwarts, but if you did, you'd see the influence the Malfoy name carries at the most prestigious school of magic in Great Britain. He'd have to go to school with this prat. Fantastic." Harry couldn't help but shoot back. "Generally speaking, people who carry influence don't need to talk about it so much." Draco sniffed again, though he couldn't quite pull off the sophisticated pose he was angling for. "Well, my father is a senior member of the Board of Education, and what with Professor Severus Snape being a close family friend and mentor, I'm guaranteed preferential treatment." Harry physically held back a jerk of surprise. Severus, as in Snape. This absolute twit knew him, had a relationship with him. It took Harry a moment to identify the feeling rising in his chest. Betrayal and jealousy. Why would I feel that way? It's not like Snape is my. He's just. Well, I don't know what he is to me, but I trust him enough to tell him things I never told anyone. "Hey, are you even listening to me?" Draco demanded. Harry quickly regained his composure, complete with a disdainful raise of his eyebrow. I wouldn't know. Perhaps your voice shares the effects of a mild sedative. For a moment, Draco looked stumped. Does he not know what a sedative is? I win. Draco took a haughty breath, but before he could respond, both he and Harry froze when they heard the approaching footsteps of the adults. Without pausing for a breath, Harry was out the door before Draco could so much as blink. Back in the sitting room beside the fireplace, Severus' eyes were squeezed tightly shut in concentration as he incanted. The focus and exertion it took to readjust these particular monitors when unable to locate the subject was notoriously draining. Finally, beads of sweat running down his face, the job was done. Harry was in Nocturne Alley, though he could not determine the exact location. Wonderful, of all places to end up, the very dredges of society, predators. Severus sprinted across the grounds and through the enchantments surrounding his property. He disapparated, half convinced that his trip was sped up by his utter panic. Harry stumbled out into the street, his eyes darting warily back and forth. It was very dimly lit by the occasional gas lamp set outside deserted storefronts, the darkness only adding to the grimy, sinister feel of the area. Harry had the impression that there was something heavy, almost palpable, in the air that sucked away most of the light that the lamps did emit. The familiar, well-earned street instincts began to take over as he glanced around carefully for potential threats, his senses on overdrive. Well, I guess the next step is to find my way to Diagon Alley, which hopefully isn't too far. For whatever reason, Harry did not feel nearly as anxious as he would have expected to be. This is the first time I've been on my own since I got to Snape's house. Despite the foreboding surroundings, Harry had missed his independence. Being told when to eat and not to dangle from tree branches, talking about his feelings, that was pretty foreign to him. But this, navigating the streets and keeping out of sight, was right up his alley. He didn't need anyone to protect him, didn't need Snape. He walked down the darkened street, scarcely breathing, keeping to corners and trash bins in an effort to conceal himself. At the same time, Harry felt quite calm. He was in control here. He walked on silently, looking around interestedly, if cautiously. He stiffened when his eyes caught on a suspicious-looking person of indeterminate gender leaning against a wall. The person flashed their teeth at him, and Harry reached reflexively into his pocket for his penknife. Bloody hell! The realization of the absence of his penknife slapped Harry squarely in the face. This was not his turf. This was the magical world, where a knife, even if he had it, would offer little protection against an experienced wizard. Harry shoved away the growing fear, forcing himself to breathe evenly. You've lived through much worse than this. Just find a way out of here and keep out of sight. You'll be fine. He'd been moving for barely a few more moments when his reassurances were proven false. Something grabbed onto his sleeve quite suddenly, and he jerked back, swinging around to find what appeared to be an old woman clutching his sleeve with a surprisingly powerful grip. Her face was deathly pale, and her eyes, which glowed unnaturally bright, were partially concealed by a thick curtain of dark grey hair. "Lost, are you, child?" the woman croaked, her cracked lips twisted into a perverse sort of smile. Harry tried to wrench his arm out of her grasp, but the woman was stronger than she appeared. "I'm fine, thank you," said Harry, taking small comfort in the fact that his voice remained steady. Show no fear, nonsense," the woman crowed. "I'll show you just where you need to go." She yanked Harry's arm, pulling him along the road. The adrenaline kicked in then. Harry clawed wildly at her hand, and a surge of heat rushed from his fingertips, forcing the woman to release him with a shriek of pain and anger. Without pausing for a further reaction on her part, Harry bolted in the opposite direction, glancing behind him to see if she was following. It was for that reason that Harry didn't notice the huge, hulking figure blocking his path until he ran straight into it and was sent flying backwards onto the pavement. "What are you doing down here, boy?" Harry looked up quickly, gasping for breath, to see a giant of a man, face half concealed with bushy, wiry black hair and beard. The man would have been frightening if not for the warmth of his beetle-black eyes and quizzical smile. "Can you talk?" the giant asked. The question might have been offensive if not for the sincerity of the man's tone. Harry exhaled, his breath coming out in a slight laugh of relief. "Yeah, I was just lost. Floo powder." The man gave a nod of understanding. "First time, eh? Here, let me help you." Without waiting for a response, the giant leaned down to pull Harry up. He actually felt his feet leave the ground until the man set him down. So were you trying to get to Diagon? Harry nodded, brushing soot from his shirt. I can help ye with Thar. Yeah, with. I was with Professor Snape, who says he even knows who Snape is anyway, but it seemed he did. Ah, Professor Snape. Clever man he is. Command can be too hard to track. I am down. The giant gripped Harry's upper arm to lead him down the road, and Harry didn't resist. There was something about this man that seemed trustworthy, familiar even as though Harry had known him once and forgotten. I'm Hagrid by T.H. Way, groundskeeper at Hogwarts. He said that last bit in a proud tone. What's your name? Harry, he said quietly, brushing soot off his face with his free hand. The giant Hagrid stopped suddenly, releasing Harry's arm to look him in the eye. Harry, Hagrid whispered. He stared into Harry's eyes for a moment, his own eyes welling up with tears. Without warning, he yanked Harry into a bone-crushing hug. Harry gasped in surprise, attempting weakly to pull himself away. But he was helpless to free himself from the grip of this huge, soft giant who was currently clutching him desperately, his chest heaving with great, gulping sobs. Finally, Hagrid released him, and Harry staggered backwards, rubbing his arms and breathing hard. He looked up to see Hagrid looking at him fondly, black eyes still wet with tears. Last time I saw ye, you was jus a baby, Hagrid said in a thick voice, fishing out an oversized handkerchief from a pocket in his enormous overcoat. You look jus like your dad, and you got your mum's eyes. Lovely she was, and both your parents such good people. He paused to blow his nose loudly. Tiny little thing, ye were. Fit in the palm o' my hand, Hagrid continued his ramble as he led Harry down the narrow road, passing by rickety sign nailed to a wall which indicated that the area was called Nocturne Alley. So, how did ye end up with Professor Snape, Harry? He picked ye up from your relatives. Harry tensed at that. I live with him now. Hagrid peered down at Harry, an open look of surprise on his face. Really? How'd tha happen? Harry shrugged, not really in the mood to discuss the details. Thankfully, Hagrid let it go, continuing to ramble on about the grandness of Hogwarts. Great place, Hogwarts is. Loved my time there. Harry noticed that the road was gradually widening and brightening. It seemed that they'd finally reached the exit. He then spotted a familiar figure in dark robes moving swiftly in their direction. Severus stepped through the crumbling archway of Nocturne Alley, quickening his stride as his eyes gradually adjusted to the unlit dankness of the alley. Through narrowed eyes, Severus noticed a large, hulking shadow moving toward him, gradually making itself known to be a quite familiar individual. Hagrid. He knows the alley well. He may be of some help. Hagrid, said Severus tersely when he was near enough. Have you? He stopped when his eyes landed on Harry, small and insignificant, partially hidden behind Hagrid's huge figure. Oh, thank Merlin. Scanning the child rapidly with his eyes for injury, Severus pulled Harry toward him by the shoulder. You are unharmed, he said tensely. The child nodded, eyes on the ground. Hand still gripping Harry's shoulder tightly, Severus glanced back up at Hagrid, who was overlooking the scene with a somewhat bemused, though fond expression. Thank you, Hagrid, you have been most helpful, Severus said, wiping all traces of concern from his face. His hand still felt shaky with the aftermath of his worry. It's no trouble. Bess, keep a close eye on young Harry here, Hagrid replied jovially. Though he knew Hagrid meant nothing by it, Severus felt both guilty and affronted at the insinuation that he was not properly looking after the boy. Well, I haven't been doing a particularly good job, have I? Considering what the boy has gotten up to since coming into my care, I most certainly intend to, Severus said sharply. We'd best be on our way. Still gripping Harry's shoulder tightly, he turned away to lead him down the alley. See ye at Hogwarts then, Harry, Severus, Hagrid called from behind. Severus nodded without looking back. For a few long moments, Severus walked alongside the child in silence, his hand still gripping the child's shoulder. It was only when the boy attempted to tug himself out of Severus' grip when he realized just how tightly he'd been clutching the boy. Severus immediately released Harry, wanting to kick himself. You must be careful with the boy. You cannot be taking your anger at your own negligence out on him. Severus sighed, looking down at the boy. Harry looked odd, not particularly frightened or anxious, just more reserved in Severus' presence that he'd been in quite a while. Perhaps he did run into trouble, Severus realized with a jolt. Did anything untoward occur in the alley, Harry? No, sir, Harry said quietly, looking at the ground. You are absolutely sure? Severus asked, frowning. Yes, sir, nothing happened. I was just trying to find my way out when I ran into Hagrid. Severus frowned again, but he said no more. Chapter 17. Creature Comforts. Chapter text. Harry's eyes widened as he and Snape stepped into the bright, bustling Diagon Alley, a far cry from the dimly lit, dusty roads of Knockturn Alley. He'd never imagined that a place could look so magical. The scene really did look like something out of a fairy tale. There were crowds of witches and wizards clad in various hues of robes, some plain and dark like Snape wore his, and others with embellishments such as wide lapels, lace, and brightly colored stitching. Some wore what Harry would have considered normal clothing, if not for the fact that they were several decades, or centuries, out of date, though Harry did spot the occasional person wearing jeans. "Come along," said Snape, prodding Harry's arm to get him moving from where he had paused in wonder by the arched entrance. Harry quickened his stride, his eyes darting back and forth in a desperate attempt to take everything in. He could see shops with names like Magical Menagerie, Slug and Jigger's Apothecary, Potage's Cauldron Shop, Madame Malkin's Robes for all occasions. He did notice that, despite the crowd, the eyes of every person that walked by seemed to slide right over him and Snape, as though they were invisible, or perhaps an uninteresting part of the scenery. Had Snape cast some sort of spell? Harry was about to ask when they reached the outside of a very tall, regal-looking white building. "This is Gringotts," Snape said as he led Harry up the marble staircase to the wide, imposing doors which swung open at the touch of Snape's wand tip. Aside from the clearly non-human tellers, there was nothing particularly odd about the place, though it was considerably grander than Harry would have imagined a bank to be. "Goblins. That's what they are," thought Harry, recalling the conversation he and Snape had had about the bank. As they neared the counters, Snape fished a small metal object from his pocket and handed it to Harry. "Your key," he said in a low voice. "It has been kept safe for you until now, though I imagine you prefer to keep hold of it hereafter." Dumbledore probably had it, Harry thought with an inward frown, but he simply nodded his thanks as he accepted the key. Then a sudden thought occurred to him. "Has anyone been able to access my account?" he asked suspiciously. "No. No one but the legal owner is allowed access." Harry breathed a sigh of relief. They approached the counters, which reached above Harry's eye level, and he felt very small as a severe-looking goblin peered down at him. He squared his shoulders, refusing to display timidity. "Mr. Harry Potter would like to make a withdrawal," Snape said smoothly. The goblin leaned in closer, his shiny black eyes digging into Harry with an unnerving focus. "Key, please," the goblin finally said in a gravelly voice. Harry set it on the counter, standing on the balls of his feet to reach it. The goblin pronounced it satisfactory, and not 5 minutes later, Harry, Snape, and a different goblin had ridden the dizzying cart right down to Harry's vault and emerged in front of a thick metal door, which the goblin unlocked with Harry's key. Harry stared. He had never, in his wildest daydreams, imagined that he'd have such a large amount of money in his possession. There were mounds of gold, silver, and bronze coins stacked nearly to the ceiling, so much so that it didn't even seem real. "All this is mine. It was just sitting here all this time." Harry felt Snape press a small, velvet pouch into his hand, but he made no move to fill it. He continued to gape, transfixed at the immense sum of money piled before him, entirely overwhelmed. How much is this worth? Does this mean I never have to work for money? Or is wizard gold worth less? What do I do with all of this? "Mr. Potter." Harry looked up quickly, and Snape seemed to pick up on Harry's utter confusion. He moved to assist Harry in filling the pouch, which seemed to be capable of holding far more coins than its size suggested, explaining the wizarding monetary system in clear terms as he did. Apparently, the gold was worth quite a bit. A short while later, Harry and Snape exited the bank, and Harry couldn't help patting his pocket every few moments to remind himself that the money was real. An image of a pale, aristocratic boy rose in his mind as he did so, and Harry forced back a scowl. "I bet Draco never had to think about such things. He has everything. Why does he get to have Snape too?" "Is there a problem, Mr. Potter?" Snape cut into his thoughts. Harry shook his head, avoiding Snape's eyes. There was a slight pause. "Are you absolutely certain that you did not encounter any trouble?" Snape pressed, a tinge of urgency lacing his tone. "Yes, sir," Harry said tonelessly. Harry heard the man sigh, and he flailed a bit when Snape's hand wrapped around his upper arm and pulled him to the side of the cobblestone road. "Look at me." Harry obeyed reluctantly, not a little apprehensive at Snape's irritated tone. The man's face was tight, and he immediately trapped Harry within his dark, assessing gaze. "Due to your record of being less than honest with me about matters concerning your well-being, I am having a very difficult time believing that nothing occurred in that alley." Harry opened his mouth to deny it, but Snape held up a finger, silencing him. "I suggest that you think over your response carefully," he said in a near whisper, his gaze sharp and direct, leaving Harry no room to avoid it. "I will not tolerate lies. Not about this." Harry stiffened slightly, but he refused to shrink back. Why is he pushing this? He doesn't care. As soon as school starts, I'll just be another student to him, and he'll only care about Draco. "Harry," Snape said warningly. Harry sucked in an annoyed breath. Nothing happened. Snape leaned down so his face was inches from Harry's. Harry tried to step back, but Snape held him in place by the shoulders. "I may be an expert legilimens, but I do not have to access your mind to know that you are not being honest with me." Harry remained silent, and Snape continued to hold him in place, his gaze unwavering. "He's seriously not going to let this go, and he's invading my personal space." Interesting that Harry found it more irritating than threatening. "Fine," Harry bit out, yanking himself out of Snape's grasp. Snape allowed it, waiting patiently for him to continue. "I ran into this kid, Draco." Harry paused for a moment, reluctant to continue. Snape raised an eyebrow in warning. "He's just a conceited jerk, and he said you're his mentor," Harry muttered, feeling idiotic that such a minor thing could upset him. Snape closed his eyes for a moment, releasing his grip on Harry's shoulders. "Come with me." Harry squinted confusedly as Snape turned and led the way down the road, expertly weaving his way through the hordes of people. They eventually stopped in front of Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. An ice cream parlor. Snape sat at an empty table in the outdoor seating area, pointing to the chair opposite him. Harry sat, peering around apprehensively. Snape swiveled a menu around to face Harry. "Choose your preference." Harry stared at the menu of the various ice cream flavors, entirely at a loss. There were familiar flavors such as chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, but the menu also boasted flavors such as butterbeer. Whatever that was, licorice, Earl Grey, and lavender, how was he supposed to choose? What did any of this even taste like? "Harry." Harry looked up, then immediately looked away, ashamed that he couldn't handle a task as simple as selecting a flavor of ice cream. I don't know what to choose," he mumbled, flitting his eyes up briefly before lowering them again to stare at the menu. Snape looked at him carefully for a moment, then plucked the menu from his hands. "I would recommend the dulce de leche. It has long been a favorite of mine." Harry nodded, relieved, and Snape tapped the menu with his wand twice. "The order is transferred to the kitchen," Snape said in response to Harry's questioning look. Harry nodded again, feeling awkward. "I'm sitting with Snape at an ice cream parlor. This is just strange. So, you have enjoyed the dubious pleasure of Draco Malfoy's company, I take it. Dubious is one word for it." "Yes." Snape leaned forward in his seat, clasping his hands together with his elbows resting on the table. He has been raised in a wealthy, privileged home, which has lent itself to engendering within him a sense of entitlement. "Damn right it has," Harry muttered under his breath. Snape raised an eyebrow. "Did I just say that out loud?" "Sorry," Harry whispered. Snape inclined his head, shifting in his seat slightly. "I am acquainted with the Malfoys and their son by proxy. And you care more about him. However," Snape continued, raising his voice as if sensing the turn of Harry's thoughts, "Draco has a tendency to exaggerate. I have tutored him on several occasions, yes, but I have no intention of providing him with preferential treatment in school, as he undoubtedly implied." Harry looked down, chewing his lip uncomfortably. "Your orders, gentlemen." Harry looked up to see a waiter with their ice cream orders hovering in the air in front of him. Snape thanked the waiter and paid him, at which point the ice creams settled neatly on the table. Harry stared at his ice cream, a sense of fear suddenly overtaking him. He was 6 years old, and he'd been watching enviously for days as Dudley scarfed down pints of the ice cream Aunt Petunia had stocked up on for the summer. "We must keep our Didikins hydrated," she'd said dotingly. She had also made no secret of the fact that ice cream was too good for freaky, ungrateful little whelps. Harry had already known by then that he was freaky and ungrateful, but that did not prevent his mouth from watering nor his stomach from rumbling as he watched Dudley eat, the sweet, melting treat dripping down his cousin's pudgy chin. Maybe if I'm really, really good, I'll get to have some too, Harry's young, still fairly innocent mind reasoned. So he tried. He did everything he was told immediately, without dawdling or complaints. He even went to his cupboard early to keep out of the way, and he got up extra early to prepare breakfast. But no one seemed to notice, and day after hot summer's day, Harry was forced to watch Dudley enjoying the ice cream, the envy and longing almost too much to bear. Harry was lucky if he was given a drink of water after a long day doing chores in the sun. And one day, it got to be too much. It was the hottest day of the year. Harry had known that from overhearing the man on the Weather Channel saying so before Dudley had waddled in and demanded that Vernon change the channel. It hadn't prevented Aunt Petunia from putting Harry to work as usual. She had also neglected to feed him that morning, and he was forced to tend to the garden and mow the lawn despite the suffocating heat, his attempts to ignore his crippling thirst proving futile as he repeatedly wiped sweat from his forehead and squeezed his eyes shut to combat the dizziness. So that night, Harry had snuck out of his cupboard, which somehow had unlocked of its own accord, and crept toward the kitchen, certain that at an hour as late as this, the Dursleys would be fast asleep. He stood on tiptoe to open the freezer, straining to grab hold of the ice cream carton, which was stored on one of the higher shelves. So close, yet so tantalizingly out of reach. At the time, Harry had figured that it was because he'd wished for it so hard that it happened. The carton of chocolate ice cream floated off of its shelf and fell slowly through the air into his open, waiting hands. Harry stared in awe and wonder, and his hands trembled as he eased off the lid. He dipped his finger into the frozen treat, eyes wide with excitement, when, boy, Harry had never really remembered what happened next. Harry swallowed, then looked up at Snape's concerned face, forcing his hands to remain still. He tried to say something, but his throat felt too dry. Stop being so pathetic. He's not like them. Ice cream tends to melt if left to its own devices for too long. Harry lifted his spoon, but he couldn't bring himself to use it. What is it, Harry? Harry couldn't speak, and though ashamed by the show of weakness, he lowered his head into his hands. At least he wouldn't have to see the look on Snape's face, pitying, annoyed, or worse. But Snape reached out to pull his hands away from his face, which Harry allowed more out of surprise than anything else. The man then picked up Harry's spoon, scooped up some ice cream, and handed it back. Snape then took a bite of his own ice cream with a casual air. That was what brought Harry back to the present. Snape eating ice cream. Harry took a tentative bite and was immediately deluged in the pleasure of something he'd never had but always wanted. He couldn't say for certain, but he was inclined to assume that ice cream from non-magical shops did not include tiny little balls of caramel that burst in his mouth at every bite. After scraping the last bits of ice cream from the edges of his bowl, Harry set down his spoon and glanced up to find Snape looking at him contemplatively. I was never allowed ice cream, Harry oddly felt compelled to say. Oh, I was never allowed much of anything, really. Snape was silent for a moment. I imagine that must have been difficult, watching other children receive that which you did not, Snape said in a low voice. Harry bit his lip. I tried to sneak some ice cream once. That endeavor did not end well, I gather. Harry paused. I don't remember, he whispered. Snape looked at Harry, his expression twisted into something that Harry could not begin to unravel. He then reached out his hand slowly to cover Harry's. Despite what your prior experiences may have taught you, Harry, you are entitled to the basic comforts that all children are given. Harry nodded, his throat dry again. Lowering his eyes, he stared into the melted remains of his ice cream. He then felt Snape's hand leave his and grasp his chin, forcing Harry to meet his eyes. Regardless of my familiarity with Draco, you not he are my first priority, said Snape intently. That will not change once school begins. Yes, sir, Harry whispered. Snape released Harry's chin, then cleared his throat. As it seems we are done here, do you have any preference as to where we should go first? My wand, Harry immediately replied. Snape nodded his acquiescence, and they both rose from their seats and made their way down the road. Before long, they reached a small shop with peeling gold letters on the door that indicated its name to be Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. Snape pushed open the door, and a faint ring reverberated from somewhere above their heads. Though it was empty, dim, and somewhat dusty, the room all but pulsated with magical energy. Harry shivered slightly. "Good afternoon," a soft voice suddenly spoke. Harry turned his head quickly to see a small, thin man with wispy, silver hair. His wide, pale eyes, which matched his hair, seemed to stare straight through Harry, as though the man could decipher his innermost thoughts just by looking. Harry nodded back, resisting the impulse to lower his eyes. He heard the rustle of Snape's robes as he leaned against the wall. "Harry Potter, I've been expecting you," the man said in a whispery voice. "How does he know my name?" I didn't think people knew how I looked. No one else recognized me, but that might have been because of Snape's spell. Harry stiffened as the man drew closer, the intense, silver gaze unnerving him. "You remind me of another young man I once knew," the man whispered. "So much potential." There was a pause, while Harry and Ollivander continued to stare at one another. Those with the potential to do great things, too, possessed the ability to do great harm. Harry furrowed his brow slightly, unnerved. This man knows things, Harry realized. He knows about people, he understands them. I suppose that comes with being a wand maker, because wands relate to people's personalities. That's what it said in that book, anyway. Harry wished the man would look away. "Well, to business," Ollivander finally said. He gestured for Harry to follow him to the counter, summoning an ordinary-looking tape measure with a flip of his wrist. "Wand arm. Right." Ollivander flicked his wand, setting the tape measure to action while he pilfered through the boxes. Why exactly does the distance between my eyes matter for a wand? Harry wondered, bemused, as the tape measure continued its work. Ollivander returned shortly, his arms piled with long, narrow boxes. He set them down on the counter, banished the tape measure, and began sorting through the boxes, eventually pulling out a thin, light brown wand. "Hazelwood and unicorn hair, 9¼ inches," said Ollivander, pressing the wand into Harry's hand. Harry closed his fingers around it, unsure of what to do. "Go on, give it a wave," said Ollivander impatiently. Harry did as he said, but the wand was snatched out of his hand within seconds. The pattern repeated itself until the counter was piled with wands of varying color and sizes, and empty boxes were strewn all over the floor. The odd thing was that the more wands Harry attempted, the more pleased Ollivander seemed to become. "Ah, tricky customer," he said, all but rubbing his palms together in glee. Perhaps he enjoyed the challenge of it. He rummaged through the shelves near the back of the store, then slid out one box carefully. "Perhaps, though, would it be wise?" Harry heard the man mutter to himself. Ollivander walked over, and yet another wand was pressed into his hand. "Harley and Phoenix feather, 11 inches. Go on." Harry gripped the handle tightly, lifting the wand to shoulder height, and a sudden feeling of warmth rose up his arm, seeming to shoot directly into his heart. He brought the wand down quickly with a gasp, and staggered, just managing to keep his feet, when intensely bright silver and gold sparks exploded from the wand's tip. Ollivander hurried over, the very picture of delight, waving his hands to restore the rejected wands back to their respective places on the shelves. "A powerful wizard you are indeed, Mr. Potter." The man drew closer, meeting Harry's eyes. Harry stared back, still clutching the wand, liking the feeling it gave him. It seemed as though Ollivander wanted to say more, or perhaps he was searching for something, because his eyes seemed to shutter after several moments, and he turned away to ring up Harry's purchase. Harry soon exited the shop alongside Snape, and they were quiet for a while, as Harry mulled over what Ollivander had said. Great potential. The potential to do great harm. What did that mean? Who was the other young man Ollivander had mentioned? "Perhaps you'd like to collect your textbooks," Snape eventually said, cutting into Harry's thoughts. Harry nodded his acquiescence, and they continued their leisurely walk down the cobblestone road. "And you'll require new shoes at the very least." Harry looked up at Snape, startled. "New shoes?" The man glanced down at his scuffed trainers with a derisive look. "Merlin only knows how long you've been wearing those, and they're certainly unfit for cold weather." He paused, furrowing his brow. "I imagine you'll also need an assortment of winter clothes. The provisions Albus provided when you first came to my home will not extend that far." Harry glanced down at his shoes. Sure, he'd had them for years, but they'd held up all right. Now that he thought about it, it didn't quite make sense that they still fit him after all this time, and that the soles hadn't completely worn away. Magic. Obviously. Harry was pulled out of his musings when they reached a bookstore, Flourish and Blatz. Now we're talking, Harry thought with an internal grin, rushing over to pull open the door ahead of Snape and entered the crowded, bustling shop. It wasn't very large, but bookshelves had been crammed into every possible and impassable spot, separated into multiple sections, and Harry could not decide which he wanted to explore first. The sections titled Potions, Charms, Transfiguration, and the like were unsurprising, but Brumology, Enchanted Artifacts, and Muggle social and antisocial habits gave him pause. There was even a fiction section, and it hadn't even occurred to him that there might be a market for fiction in the wizarding world. Harry glanced up when Snape pressed the booklist into his hands. "We'll gather your school books first, and afterwards you may peruse the shop to your heart's content." Harry grinned a bit at Snape's darkly teasing tone and hurried over to the potions section to find magical drafts and potions by Arsenius Jigger. More than an hour had passed by the time they paid for Harry's books and left the store. Though he didn't need to buy a new cauldron as Snape had so many spares, he still needed a telescope, not to mention robes. "Harry." Harry swiveled around at the familiar voice to see Hagrid standing in front of Ilep's Owl Emporium, holding a snowy owl in a cage. "I remembered your birthday's coming up, and I figured you'd need an owl for sending post and all that." Harry stared at Hagrid, his mouth slightly open. Hagrid had bought this for him. He tilted his head at the owl, the real live owl, which was blinking her amber eyes at him in an oddly knowing manner. "Harry," Snape said in a low tone, "it is polite to accept a gift when offered." Harry gave a slight jolt, flushing, and stepped closer to Hagrid, who was holding the cage out to him with a tentative smile. Thank you," Harry said in a slightly shaky voice. "You didn't have to." "Course I did," Hagrid said as Harry took the cage from him. "It's your birthday. It'd be a crime not to." Harry poked his fingers through the bars of the cage and stroked the owl's head carefully. It gave him a sort of haughty look, as though it was tolerating his administrations for now, but may later redact its permission. "She's a clever old girl," Hagrid said, patting the owl's head through the bars with his enormous finger. "One o' the most reliable sorts. So she was a girl. What does she eat? She'll get most o' her food from hunting, but you can get treats for her at the shop." Hagrid reached over to ruffle Harry's hair, his touch surprisingly gentle for how incredibly large he was. "You take good care o' her, and she's as loyal as they come." "Thank you," Harry said again, still not quite believing that he'd been given such a gift. He glanced up at Snape, who was surveying the scene with a nonchalant air, and he gave Harry a faint nod. Hagrid trudged away after another ruffle of Harry's hair, and Harry followed Snape towards their next destination, his brand new owl in tow. Chapter 18. Realizations. Chapter text as Harry brushed his hand through Hedwig's soft, white feathers, his lips turned upward against his will. He named his owl after Hedwig of Silesia, the patron saint of orphans, so sue him. "You know, it's weird, living with Snape," Harry murmured to her, moving over to the window seat in his bedroom with Hedwig perched on his shoulder. "Once I left Privet Drive, I thought I wouldn't want to have anyone in charge of me again." Harry paused to settle further into the seat, transferring Hedwig to his lap. "But with Snape, I sort of like it. He's almost like A." His voice trailed off. Hedwig blinked at him, tilting her head in a contemplative manner. How much of what he said did she truly understand? Harry would have liked to think she understood most of it. It was a comforting thought to believe that he could tell her anything at all, and she'd never be able to use it against him. "You had parents once, didn't you?" Harry asked softly, stroking the feathers on her head. Hedwig hooted softly, hopping up to nip Harry's ear. Harry rested his head against hers for a moment. "I'm going soft," Harry muttered to himself. Noticing the time, Harry rose carefully and made his way downstairs for breakfast, Hedwig still perched on his shoulder. "You've become inseparable, I see," drawled Snape as Harry entered the kitchen. Harry shrugged with his free shoulder, giving Snape a half-smile, and Hedwig fluttered away and through the open window. Harry sat down, reaching for the fruit bowl, and he noticed a long, thin package propped against the table beside his chair. "Ah, sir," Harry asked tentatively, looking up. "It is your 11th birthday today, is it not?" "Oh, right, it is." For obvious reasons, Harry had never set much store by birthdays. "You didn't have to get me anything," Harry mumbled, looking down at his plate. "I am aware of that," Snape said, lifting his teacup with 2 fingers to take a sip. Harry chewed on his lip, staring at the package. He swallowed. Why was this so difficult? Maybe because he made a firm decision to stop caring that he never received presents on his birthday when Dudley had been given piles of gifts for every minor occasion. And maybe because that stupid, illogical side of his brain feared that the gift would be snatched away as soon as he indicated that he wanted it. Get a grip. Snape isn't like that. He knew that, he knew it. But what if go on, open it if you wish, Snape prompted. Harry glanced up cautiously and met the man's eyes. Calm, nonchalant, almost uncaring as to whether Harry would accept the gift or not. That made things easier somehow. Harry pulled the package closer and carefully unwrapped the brown paper, then opened the box inside. It was a broomstick. It was the broomstick that he'd been using, but it had been polished to perfection, and its bristles had been straightened and untangled so that it looked brand new. Harry stared at it in shock, then looked up again, wide-eyed at Snape. The man's face was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable warmth in his eyes. First years are not allowed their own broomsticks. However, I am permitted to keep it for you while school is in session, granting you permission to make use of it when I see fit. Harry inhaled, finally regaining control of his vocal cords. Sir, aye, thank you. Snape gave him a small, fleeting smile, then immediately schooled his face back into its normal, unreadable state. Eat first, then feel free to give it a test run. Some of its features have been updated. A short while later, Harry was zooming through the air, Hedwig flying alongside him. So, I gather you preferred to remain outdoors while living with your relatives. Yes. The child paused, unconsciously picking at the bark of the tree behind him and chewing his lower lip. Severus wanted to pull it out of his teeth. I always feel more relaxed outside, Harry said quietly. If the child was as mistreated as I have been led to believe, the outdoors would certainly provide a sense of safety for him. Merlin knows I felt the same way. You are not alone in that sentiment, Severus said. Yeah, I know. The child looked wistful for a moment, then seemed to pull himself back into the present. I slept in a cupboard, Harry said suddenly. Severus, eyebrows shot to his hairline, Merlin's greying beard. Did you? Slowly, Harry nodded. It was the cupboard under the stairs. They didn't like to waste space on me. A cupboard under the stairs that explains his reaction to my storage cupboard. Merlin, how can I possibly respond to that? Severus studied the boy carefully. Harry's eyes looked cold in that moment, almost deadened, as though he had tried so hard to deny all feelings associated with that particular experience that the emotions had bypassed cold and became almost too numb to bear. That day, in the laboratory, when I told you to fetch a spare cauldron, Severus began. The cupboard must have brought up some difficult recollections for you. The boy's face paled then, and his eyes took on a glassy sort of sheen. His mouth contorted, and for a moment Severus thought he might flee. But the child then seemed to calm, his shoulders dropping and his breath slowing to a normal pace, though his face remained pale and he seemed tired. The sort of tired that came with time, with pain and fruitless struggle, rarely seen in one so young. It doesn't matter anymore what happened there, Harry said flatly. Harry, the boy shook his head. Upon closer look, Harry was visibly holding himself still, and it was apparent that he was working to prevent his lower lip from quivering. Severus took pity on the child, and he was about to excuse him from the conversation when the boy visibly relaxed. It was as though he had flicked a switch, shutting down all emotions regarding the topic they had been discussing, so rapidly it was unnerving. Harry turned his head to look towards the edges of the property. Why do you live here with so many protections? Severus blinked. Well, that is a somewhat drastic change of topic, though we were discussing the outdoors, and the cupboard he mentioned is surely one of the reasons for his preference of them. But of all the questions he could have asked, how can I provide him with an honest answer for this one, considering the nature of the truth? And how can I not, considering what I have asked of him to reveal about himself? Severus blew out a slow, controlled breath. It became necessary during the last war for me to reside in a protected area, considering my role in it. He paused, knowing that it was not enough, and that the boy was bound to probe further. What was your role? Severus closed his eyes for a moment. He should not be burdened with the knowledge of my tainted past. It may erode his sense of safety, and it will likely frighten him. Yet I cannot hide this from him, not now, when his trust is still so fragile. Severus opened his eyes to look directly at Harry. I served as a spy in the war, acting as a servant of the Dark Lord, whilst relaying all information that I received to the Order of the Phoenix, which was a secret society working to overthrow him. The boy tilted his head, his forehead furrowed. How were you able to do that? Why were you the one to do that? How did Voldemort not figure it out? Severus had to actively restrain himself from flinching at the mention of his old master and nemesis, name, and at what the child had figured out. He is far too clever for an 11-year-old. I cannot lie to him. It will be better in the long run if he learns the truth now. That did not prevent him from feeling a profound sense of imminent loss as he opened his mouth to speak. I was a very angry, misguided young man, and I was led to believe that a life in the service of the Dark Lord would provide me with opportunities that I would not otherwise be given. Severus paused for a moment, both to gather his thoughts and to monitor the child's expression. It was impressively unreadable, which Severus took as a good omen. The boy was not recoiling in horror or disgust, after all. I am not being entirely honest with him. I cannot be. If he knew that I indirectly caused his parents' deaths, I would lose whatever trust I have earned from him. And where would that leave him? I spent a brief period of time in the service of the Dark Lord, he continued, during which I realized the error of my ways, and I offered my services to the Order of the Phoenix. I was provided with this home, as the Dark Lord and his followers knew the location of my previous place of residence. Severus had been focusing his gaze slightly to the left of the boy's face while he spoke. He shifted his eyes back to meet Harry's, both pained and resigned. Harry listened carefully while Snape spoke, noticing that the man seemed unable to meet his eyes. He's ashamed, Harry realized. He expects me to hate him for it. But how can I, considering? The man stopped speaking and met Harry's eyes squarely. He seemed to be steeled for something. I think everyone's done things they wish they hadn't, Harry said haltingly. He must have had it bad like me to do what he did. Does that make me normal or both of us strange? Snape was looking at Harry with a rare glimmer of incredulity in his eyes. You are wiser than many decades your senior. Harry shook his head violently. No, I'm not. It's only because I did something worse than they did. Snape narrowed his eyes. You disagree. Harry thought back, recalling a flash of fear and rage, and a great surge of energy. Vernon had been sent flying through the air, crashing into the wall on the opposite side of the room, his head smashing into it with a sickening crack. He'd thought he'd killed him until Vernon let out a horrible, strangled moan, a sound that had plagued one too many nightmares. Harry had left for good after that incident. He'd packed his meager belongings as quickly as he could, Aunt Petunia's shrill screams and Vernon's agonized groans pressing into his eardrums, invading his senses like a poison that he'd never quite been able to expel. He'd run for the door, stumbling in his haste, but before passing the threshold, he'd felt Aunt Petunia's bony fingers grip his shoulder. He had turned, poised for a fight, but she'd simply pressed a wad of notes into his hand and nudged him out the door. The last thing he'd seen was Aunt Petunia mouthing two words, "I'm sorry." "Harry," Harry blinked, shaking his head as though to ward off a fly. I hurt someone really bad once." Snape opened his mouth, but Harry cut in. "I think I could have killed him," he whispered, wrapping his arms around his torso. He kept his eyes on the ground, staring resolutely at the grass. It always grew back, even when it was ripped out. Not during droughts because, resilient as it might be, it still needed water to thrive. It still needed something outside of itself to continue living. It was not self-sustaining, but was anything. A hand gripped Harry's chin and tilted it upwards, the touch familiar enough not to startle him. Snape's eyes looked gentle. He didn't seem at all disturbed. In contrast, it seemed he understood what Harry was feeling even more intimately than Harry did himself, because he did the same thing, obviously. At that thought, Harry felt his muscles slacken in relief. He hadn't realized how tightly he was holding himself. He gets it. He understands what it feels like, because he's been there. When Harry felt an arm wrap around his shoulder blades, he realized that he'd been unintentionally leaning against Snape. Embarrassed, he tried to pull himself upright, but Snape held on to him more tightly. "It's all right," the man said quietly. Harry took a few deep breaths and stayed. Snape did not speak for a few moments, and Harry was grateful for it, for those moments of space and quiet to compose himself. "I left that day," Harry said suddenly, this time successfully prying himself out of Snape's grip and backing up a step. It doesn't matter any more at this point, does it? What's the use of keeping it all to myself? Snape furrowed his eyebrows. Oh, I saw him on the floor and I ran. I never went back. Snape stared at him for a moment. Just. How long ago did that occur? Harry chewed on his lip. About a year ago. Snape stiffened, his eyes narrowing, and Harry took an unconscious step back, digging his fists into his pockets. Snape seemed to notice Harry's reaction, and his demeanor visibly calmed. Do you mean to tell me, Snape said in a controlled voice, that you were living on your own for a year before arriving here? Oh, that's what he's upset about. Harry felt that still unfamiliar, warm feeling wrapping around him like the blanket he'd always wished for on cold nights. Snape cared. About him, he shifted his eyes downward. Yeah. And you lived where? The man asked tersely. In London, on the streets, in libraries, places like that. Harry shrugged. Snape took several deep breaths. Look at me, Harry. Harry looked up anxiously. You understand that such a thing will not be permitted to occur again under any circumstance. Harry jerked his head in semblance of a nod, his mouth dry. Snape leaned down, his dark eyes catching Harry's. You will never again be forced into such a position. Do you understand me? Harry took a shaky breath, willing himself not to release the tears that were stinging the corners of his eyes. Snape took Harry's hand and gripped it firmly. Do you? Harry nodded. Severus swore under his breath as his latest adjustment to his painstakingly constructed monitors wavered, then fizzled out like a dying flame. It was for good reason that he hadn't pursued protective warding and enchantments as his profession of choice. Unlike potions, which always behaved as intended, assuming one knew what they were doing, spells such as these tended to develop, well, perhaps not a mind of their own, but a certain human-like stubbornness. They were notoriously unpredictable, and they required constant maintenance just to remain stable, not to speak of the effort it required to adjust them. And they certainly required adjustment, what with the boy's unintended romp through Nocturne Alley. With a growl of frustration, Severus dropped his wand onto his desk. He was physically drained, and he'd accomplished very little of what he'd set out to do. Despite his previous adjustment he'd made to track down the boy in Nocturne Alley, the enchantments had mostly reverted to their previous state. They only monitored the boy while he was on the property, though they would be simpler to temporarily adjust in the future, if necessary. That would have to do for now. Severus leaned back into his seat. It was well past midnight, and though he'd hoped to complete the second draft of his proposal for the changes in the latest formulation of the adrenaline draft, he had little energy remaining to invest in such a task. Even more, his thoughts kept drifting to what the boy had just revealed to him. The child had been living on the streets of London, left to fend for himself, alone, and uncared for as a stray dog. How did this escape our notice? Where was Albus? Where was I? Severus rubbed his tired, aching eyes, inadvertently knocking over an inkwell with his elbow. Muttering oaths under his breath, he rightened it with a flick of his wand. It is frankly miraculous that the boy is still alive and functional. Severus shuddered to think of the horrors the boy may have been subjected to as a homeless child, and the fact that the boy had preferred to be in that position than live one more day with his relatives. The fact that his accidental magic had flared up powerfully enough to potentially kill someone, his uncle, perhaps, though it seemed that the man had managed to live. More's the pity. Calling it a night, Severus cleared his desk and slowly made his way upstairs, deep in thought. I am not providing him with what he needs, nor am I capable of it. There are not nearly enough people in the wizarding community trained in child psychology. I do not want the child to end up like me. Severus settled into bed, clearing his mind with a bit more difficulty than usual. Albus has a hell of a lot to answer for. Harry woke up feeling groggy. As he rubbed the last vestiges of sleep out of his eyes, a thought niggled in the back of his mind. He had been having odd dreams that night, though he couldn't quite recall their exact nature. I was dreaming about something to do with Dudley, maybe all the Dursleys. Harry thought harder, still curled up in his bed, instead of immediately rising as he usually did. Then it hit him. I don't know how they died. How had he not thought of this earlier? Dumbledore had seemed to assume that Harry had already known they were dead when he found him in London, and obviously Harry wasn't going to disabuse him of that notion. Admittedly, He'd not had much time to think about it, as he'd been whisked away to live with Snape within moments of that conversation. But still, why should it matter to me anyway? It's not like they cared if I lived or not. But it did matter. Maybe, if he knew, it would give him a sense of closure so he wouldn't have to think about them anymore. And Dudley was just a kid. A short while later, Harry found himself out on the grounds in the pale yellow glow of early morning. He meandered over to his tree, his shoes making faint squelching sounds as he walked across the dewy grass. What could have caused their deaths? An accident? Did someone do it deliberately? Or it may have been wizards. Harry nearly kicked a tree trunk in frustration. I really, really need to know. It's not as if I could ask Dumbledore. He'd probably lie anyway. Hell, maybe he was even involved. No, that's pretty unlikely. He left me there in the first place, so he'd want them alive. No, I can't ask anyone. I need to find out myself so I'll know for sure. Harry glanced towards the edge of the property, not really seeing it, when the faint blur of the protective enchantments caught his gaze. He narrowed his eyes in thought, a vague idea gradually gaining clarity in his mind. Chapter 19. Cracks in the Foundation. Chapter text. The classification of spells and enchantments as wizard-made creations has long been debated. Though spells themselves have been formulated and activated by wizards, the energy put to use is drawn from the natural forces of the universe. An important argument against spells being entirely nature-based is the fact that all spells, without exception, contain flaws or holes. It has been widely agreed upon that humankind is incapable of creating a flawless form. Thus, the imperfection of spells proves their inorganic nature. The aforementioned argument poses the question of how such flaws are detected. A study performed by Orchard Jennings of Australia, 1949 present, provided the data to develop a widely acclaimed theory, the magical flaw theory, which states that the variations of magical flaws can be divided into three types. 1. The irregular vibrations of active spells used in combat, transfiguration, and charms. 2. The fractures along the foundation of static enchantments, such as protective warding, wards. There we go, Harry muttered to himself, skimming through the next few paragraphs until he reached the relevant section. Faint cracks upon static protective enchantments can be detected. Should the warding have been erected by a novice, the fractures will be relatively simple to perceive. An individual positioned within 6.5 feet of the enchantment will detect a shimmering wave traveling in a vertical direction on several points upon the length of the enchantment. If the enchantments were constructed by a trained professional, one must position themselves within 7 inches of the enchantment, and said individual may then detect an area that glows comparatively brighter than the remainder of the enchantment. To one residing within the wards, he continued to read. Breaking through the flawed area is fairly simple once detected, though there is no single method. Techniques vary according to an individual's particular strengths. The use of a wand is not strictly necessary. Harry smiled slightly as he closed the book and stuffed it back onto its shelf. Breaking through enchantments, that sounded like an endeavor he could probably manage. It took mainly focused magical strength and relatively little practical knowledge, which suited him perfectly. I just have to find a way to do it without Snape noticing. Harry picked at his food distractedly, his mind racing with the possibilities of bringing his plan to fruition. He tried to school his face into nonchalance when he noticed Snape looking at him oddly. I don't want to look like I'm plotting something. The man can read minds. Harry waited nervously for Snape to speak, convinced that, somehow, the man had discovered the nature of his most recent research topic. But Snape did not speak. He studied Harry for a few moments more, then abruptly returned to his meal. Harry continued eating in silence, anxious to finish so he could return to the library. He felt Snape's gaze burning into the top of his head yet again, and he deliberately focused his eyes on his plate. How am I going to stay out of his sight long enough to break through the spells? He's watching me more carefully than usual. But how can he know? He said he wouldn't read my mind, plus I would know it, even if he did. Harry gave a mental shrug and set down his fork, wiping his mouth surreptitiously with his napkin. Snape cleared his throat, and Harry's head shot up. Harry, Snape began, then paused, seeming almost hesitant for a moment before his face smoothed over with resolve. Harry's breath caught in his chest. It must be something bad. Why else would he act like this? He's kicking me out for sure. He doesn't want me here anymore. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you that is of a rather delicate nature, Snape said carefully. Harry was taken aback. What's that supposed to mean? Okay, Harry replied, frowning. Snape was silent for a moment. I understand that it may be an uncomfortable topic for you, Snape said in a low voice, but it is important, no, vital, that you attempt to be honest with me. Harry furrowed his brow. I would suggest we take this conversation outside, but the distant rumbling of thunder was enough to lay that idea to rest. We could just stay here, Harry muttered, wanting more than anything to get back to his books. Very well. Snape waved away the dishes and set steaming mugs of tea in their place within moments. I am going to get straight to the point, because this is not a matter to be taken lightly. Harry tensed, gripping his mug with both hands as if it stood to offer him some comfort, though the heat radiating from the porcelain did nothing to calm him. Has anyone ever touched you in any way that made you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, in any manner? Snape said clearly, his eyes focused upon Harry unblinkingly. Harry felt an uncomfortable heat rise up in his face. Did Snape really think? Harry shook his head roughly, staring at his lap. Nothing like that ever happened, I swear. He forced himself to meet Snape's eyes. My uncle only ever hit me. Nothing like. Snape leaned forward, his forehead creased. I am not just speaking of your uncle. A formerly homeless child such as yourself is a likely target for, no. And it was true, at least in the way Snape was implying. Those times he preferred not to think about when that man with the strange eyes had stared at him were not relevant, even if he'd only managed to escape worse than the leering was because he'd left, and landed himself in a dark alleyway only to be whisked away by Dumbledore. But Jade. He hadn't understood. He hadn't understood until she was long gone and hopefully safe, while he shivered under a tree with a threadbare blanket he'd pulled out of a bin and watched that man stare, and then he'd realized what it meant. No, he said again, folding his arms across his chest and lifting his head. Are you certain? The man's tone was laced with urgency and an undercurrent of something dangerous, but not to Harry. It was dangerous to someone who might have hurt him. And that was almost enough to quell the endless fear he'd felt that still hovered over his every waking moment, even though the danger had passed, and it made no sense to still be so afraid. And it did dull the sensation, just a little. Harry stood at the edge of the grounds later that day, squinting at the misty enchantments surrounding them. The rain had stopped a while ago, and the setting sun was just at a point where it beamed directly into his face, making it difficult to focus. He shifted his position slightly, shoes squelching in the wet grass, and he tilted his head until he was able to make them out without too much difficulty. Okay, I need to spot an area that glows more brightly. 20 minutes passed, and Harry had not yet been able to spot a single flaw. Of course, I had to get stuck with a bunch of professionals putting these together. They're standing in the way of scientific experimentation. Sure, scientific experimentation. That was exactly what he was doing. Though I suppose I could use that as my excuse if I get caught. Harry searched for a while longer, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to see as the sky darkened. He huffed in frustration. This would be so much easier if I could just flew to Surrey, not that it hadn't occurred to him before. Harry was quite certain, however, that there were no fireplaces in Surrey that were connected to the Floo network, and even if there were, it definitely wasn't worth the risk. He'd have to try again tomorrow. Despite the early hour, Harry readied himself for bed and clutched his blankets tightly. Why do I feel so vulnerable? That was what it was. He was feeling more wound up in this room than he had since the first week or so that he'd been there. It was easier during the day when he had something to focus on. But the night time always came to remind him that this could all be fleeting, that nothing in his life was truly secure. His ground was always shaky, and he had to tread carefully all the time, just in case it cracked beneath his feet and pulled him under. He wanted his penknife. Maybe he wouldn't use it, but just knowing that he could, if things got bad again, might be enough to help him fall asleep. Harry pressed his lips together and opened a book at random. He read for a while, though his eyes shifted in and out of focus as he struggled to ignore the unpleasant thoughts that insisted on plaguing him. Eventually, he could keep his eyes open no longer, and the book slipped from his slackened grip as he drifted off into a fitful sleep. Not for long, however. Harry let out an agonized scream and sat bolt upright in his bed, his chest heaving heavily. He dug his nails into his palms as he gradually blinked his way back into awareness, struggling to make out the dim image of his bedroom. His room, in Snape's house. Damn it, I screamed again. Harry realized he was shivering uncontrollably, and he was too overwrought to do anything but let it continue. Snape must have heard me. Harry took a shuddering breath, feeling his eyes well up with tears. I want him to come. I want him, what the hell? No, you don't. You don't want him to come. You don't want him to see you like this. You don't want him to pity you to see how weak you are. But he couldn't relax. He could almost feel Uncle Vernon's meaty hands around his throat, Petunia's cold, papery hands dragging him along by the ear. Her disgust, Vernon's fury, and the utter indifference from both of them. They weren't like Snape's hands, which were warm and never hurt, and felt as though they would protect him from anything and would maim anyone that tried to harm him. Harry felt a tear drop from his eye and down to his lip, where he could taste the salty wetness that was his pain and fear and fury, and then another tear fell, and then another, and he couldn't do a thing to stop it, and he couldn't even bring himself to care, when all he wanted was Harry, and Snape was there. Harry looked up at Snape through blurred eyes to see the man's face, wrought with concern. The sight just made him cry harder. Snape walked over slowly to sit on Harry's bed beside him. He then reached out and pulled Harry close, and Harry was too tired to pull away, too afraid, too cold, and he breathed deeply, hiding his face in the man's dressing gown. Snape rubbed Harry's back in a soothing motion, and his other hand held Harry's head pressed into his chest. Harry breathed in the scent of Snape, the scent of safety, and he gradually calmed. He didn't want to leave the embrace, not yet, so he remained where he was, his eyes closed, breathing slowly. Finally, Harry pulled away. Snape let him go, but he did not rise from the bed, and Harry was grateful. He kept his eyes trained on his lap as he pulled his blanket over it. That must have been a particularly distressing nightmare, Snape said quietly. Harry clenched his fists around his blanket. They were both still and quiet for a moment, until Snape reached out to lay a hand on Harry's shoulder. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to, because Harry heard him anyway. Snape was telling him that he could speak, that he could tell, that maybe it would loosen the nauseating tightness in his chest, just a little, to open his mouth and let the words pour out. Harry took a shuddering breath. They were scared of me. He clenched his fists, feeling uneven nails dig into his palms. Vernon, especially. Working his jaw, Harry forced himself to continue, knowing with an unnerving clarity that it had to be said, that he needed to let the words out before they poisoned him even further. It was only when my magic got stronger that Harry rolled back his shoulders, straightening his back, because it wasn't he that should be hunched over in shame. He kept hitting and hitting like he thought it'd make my magic go away, but it just made it even worse, even stronger, and he just didn't stop. I thought he'd kill me. He didn't think that I was a person. Harry cleared his throat. They hated me, and no matter what I did, he whispered. They said I was a F-freak, that I should be dead. That I deserved. Harry couldn't go on, but he didn't need to. Snape gripped his hands tightly into his own, knowing exactly what Harry needed, that he didn't want to be held like he had before, but he just needed a reminder that Snape was there. You will make an appearance in my home at precisely 9:30 this morning, or you will no longer have a potions master. With a final wave of his wand, Severus sent his patronus bearing the message on its way. How could Albus have allowed this to happen? Severus fumed, pacing the floors of the upstairs hallway. The sun had barely risen, but Severus wanted to remain in close proximity to Harry, loath for him to awaken alone after all that had transpired during the night. I'm having difficulty believing that this was all an innocent mistake on Albus' part. What was the fool thinking? Severus barely restrained himself from pounding a fist into the wall. Save it for Albus. A patronus in the form of a phoenix appeared then, bearing Albus. Affirmative reply. Severus had not expected any less. Albus knew him well enough to know what constituted an emergency. Harry kept his head down during breakfast to avoid looking Snape in the eye. After last night, he was not quite sure where he stood with the man. Harry. He forced himself to look up. Professor Dumbledore will be arriving here shortly. You need not speak with him, Snape interjected when Harry inhaled sharply. I simply thought you would rather be forewarned. Harry nodded, looking down. Why is he coming this time? I can't deal with that man anymore. Harry forcibly shifted his thoughts away from Dumbledore and towards his plan involving the wards, or rather, the lack of progress on that front. Maybe I can work on it more while they're talking. Can I go? Harry asked abruptly, setting down his fork. Snape nodded his consent, and Harry sped to the library in search of more books that might assist him in his mission. Oh, this was why I couldn't find the flaws, Harry realized as he read a passage of the book he'd selected. I was looking for them at sunset, and they're hard to see when it starts to get dark. Deeply engrossed in his reading, he was startled to hear the door of the library open. Professor Dumbledore had arrived, Snape said, standing at the doorway. He and I will be in my study. If you require assistance of any sort, do not hesitate to knock. Yes, sir, Harry muttered, hiding his anticipation. This was it. As soon as Snape and Dumbledore got talking, he could put his plan into action. A few moments after Snape exited the room, Harry snuck quietly to the door. Pushing it open carefully, hearing faint murmurings growing steadily quieter as the men walked towards Snape's study. He then heard a click. I hope Hedwig won't hate me for this, Harry thought as he made his way across the grounds. Why am I worrying about Hedwig? Snape's reaction is what I should be worried about. Harry shoved that thought away. He needed to do this. He needed to know what had happened to the Dursleys so he could forget about them and everything that had happened. Otherwise, it would mean that Vernon had won. He may have not managed to beat the magic out of Harry, but the memory of him and all that he had done would be burned into Harry's mind permanently if he didn't find a way to let it go. Harry reached the warding and scanned the enchantments carefully, positioned within what he judged to be 7 inches of them. At last, he spotted it. The faint, shimmering flaw in the spell. As soon as the door of his study clicked shut, Severus waved his wand to muffle any sounds coming from the room. So, Severus, I take it there is something of a serious manner you wish to discuss with me. Dumbledore, to his credit, was not smiling or twinkling. He obviously knew a dire situation when he saw one. If he so much as twitches a lip, I will not be responsible for my actions. Severus took a few calming breaths, intent upon confronting Albus in as rational a manner as he could manage. Tell me, Albus, exactly how closely were you keeping tabs on the child whilst he was in the dubious care of his aunt and uncle? Albus closed his eyes. I am aware that he was not treated well there. It is not difficult to tell, the boy being the way he is. Albus paused, looking tired. Severus felt no compassion. He merely tapped a foot in his impatience for Albus to continue. I felt that it would engender resentment if I made personal appearances, so I had Arabella Figg situated in the area to keep an eye on the boy. Severus raised an eyebrow. Clearly, she did not do quite as well a job as I had hoped, Albus said quietly, fingering a loose string on his dark green robes. I wish I had done things differently. It was a difficult situation for all involved. Severus took another breath, willing himself not to explode. Clearly, Albus, your best did not come close to being acceptable, he bit out. Albus closed his eyes again. I know, the boy is one of many to have paid the price for my mistakes. Severus gritted his teeth. That would be the least of it, he all but growled. Albus opened his eyes. But Harry, he is such a bright, talented child, despite what he has had to face in his short life. He is remarkable. So, clearly, his abilities nullify the wrongs that have been done to him. Albus tilted his head to the side. Certainly not. Yet the past can hardly be undone. Severus had it. He leaned forward so his face was inches from Albus. Are you aware, he said in a low, dangerous tone, that the child opted to live on the streets of London for a year rather than reside in the home of those monsters any longer? Albus' eyes widened in horrified understanding, and Severus was perversely satisfied to see the color drain out of Albus' face. You are certain. Man's shoulders sagged, and he seemed to have aged decades in only seconds. No, Severus sneered. It is a likened pastime of mine to fabricate delightful tales of this nature, yes, I am certain. Albus was silent for a long moment, a moment that felt as though it were suspended in time. He raised a faintly shaking hand to his mouth and stepped backward so his back was leaning against the wall, looking every year of his age and then some. I did not know, Severus, he croaked. Truly, I didn't. Had there been any indication, any at all, I would have taken the child in myself. He couldn't go on. His eyes glittered with what could only be tears, but they did not fall. It seemed that he had not given himself the right to allow it. Severus inhaled. I believe you, he said slowly. However, it is not me you need to convince. Albus nodded, straightening up. I must make things right by the boy. I will speak with him. No, Severus said sharply. It is clear to me that you have long given up your right to assume an authoritative role in Harry's life, other than as his headmaster. He paused while Albus took that in, and watched as the man nodded, the motion firm, decided, yet fraught with something like loss. You will speak with the boy only if he is willing, and I will remain present during any interaction you might have with him. Albus inclined his head. Of course. I want full guardianship of the boy. Severus was at first shocked to hear those words come from his mouth, but after a moment he fully agreed with the statement. He had been seeing Harry as his own for a while. Legal papers would only solidify the relationship and allow him to be there for Harry on a more consistent basis. Albus looked at him for a long moment. It shall be done. Only upon his agreement, of course, Severus said firmly. Severus stopped. He could hear a faint ringing in his ears, and a low, deep rumbling from somewhere beneath his feet. The boy has left the property. Chapter 20. The Remains. Chapter text a few months prior. Vernon Dursley blew out a last puff of smoke before tapping out his cigarette in the ashtray. Petunia hated that he'd taken up smoking, and she hated it even more when he smoked inside the house. But he'd left a window open, hadn't he? And who was she to begrudge him this one small comfort, what with the incessant migraines he'd been experiencing after her mongrel of a nephew had used his freakish powers to throw him into a wall head first. At least the little bastard was gone, probably off to torment some other poor sard who was just trying to scrape out a living for his family. And he had Dudley to think about, though he really had to get that boy on track. He was far too invested in his girly little art class and skipping out on rugby practice. After all he'd done to get that boy on the team. More than a few pounds had exchanged hands for it, and this was how his son repaid him. Vernon pressed his palms onto the kitchen table and heaved himself to his feet with a groan, his lower back protesting the movement. He trudged towards the stairs, tossing his cigarette butt into the cupboard as he passed. Petunia never cleaned in there anyway. Current day. Harry walked down the streets of the eerily silent neighborhood as quickly as he could without running. He didn't want to draw any more attention to himself than necessary, just in case someone happened to poke their head out of the window. I should have nicked the broomstick when I had the chance. That wouldn't have been an option anyway. It wasn't as though he could turn invisible too. But what were the chances he'd be able to hitch a ride to any place at all, let alone in the direction of Surrey or London, from where he'd easily be able to make his way? This neighborhood was as close to rural as it was possible to be without any actual farmland. How stupid could I be? What exactly had he been expecting? That a ride would be waiting for him right outside the door. He'd been so focused on breaking through the enchantments that he'd failed to take into account that this wouldn't be as simple as when he'd fled from Surrey, or when he'd made his way across London. There was nothing here at all, not even a lone straggler passing by. Maybe he should just go back before Snape realized he was gone. He'd go about his day and take some time to reassess the situation, to reformulate his plan so he'd be better prepared next time. Do you really think Snape hasn't already figured it out? It was actually surprising that Snape hadn't found him yet. The man would be furious, and he'd be justified. Maybe this was what would push Snape to get rid of him, or maybe he'd finally realize how worthless Harry really was, and I can't go back. I can't go back. He'll hate me, he'll hurt me, he'll kill me. He had to get away. He had to run, before Uncle Vernon caught up with him and made good on his threat to send him 6 feet under the ground, where he belonged. No. No, no, no. This can't happen again. I won't let this happen. I have to get out. I have to go. I have to go. And suddenly he did. Harry blinked. He was standing on the roof of a building, looking down at a busy, bustling road. A very familiar road, because he'd walked across it countless times. And he recognized this roof, because he'd been here too. The roof of the closest thing he'd found to home after leaving the Dursleys. This was his library. Harry took a long, deep breath, his entire body sagging with relief. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. The hard part was over. He'd made it to London, where he could make his way around by muscle memory alone. In the sunny heat of August, Harry did not feel particularly threatened as he weaved his way through the crowds, despite the altercations and violence he had witnessed and occasionally been the victim of in this city. That had mostly happened during the night, anyway, and not so much in this area, so he wasn't too bothered by the absence of his penknife, which he hadn't dared attempt to sneak back from wherever Snape had stored it. He made his way to the train station, which wasn't far, and he kept his head down and hands shoved into his pockets. No one gave him a second glance. Boarding the train wasn't difficult. He'd done it before. All he had to do was sneak on behind an older couple, looking as young and innocent as possible, and dart ahead when the train guard's head was turned. Adults rarely paid attention to anything below shoulder height. And isn't that convenient? Harry thought sourly as he slipped into an empty seat, considering that I'll probably never get any taller. Harry shifted closer to the window to peer out of the grimy glass. It would have been nice to fly, if not for the fact that the cops would have probably shot me down, thinking I was some sort of alien invasion. Harry rolled his eyes inwardly, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead to wipe away the sweat that had accumulated during his walk through London. It was certainly one of the hottest days of the summer so far. The train continued on its way, rumbling slightly at some moments, which caused the woman seated beside him to inadvertently jab her elbow into Harry's upper arm. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, dear," the woman apologized. "It's fine." He shrugged. The woman looked at him for a moment through dark eyes, surrounded by the soft wrinkles of age. Her hair was grey and curly, and she was clad in a flowered house dress, posing a distinctly unintimidating figure. Harry relaxed minutely. "Are you traveling alone?" the woman asked. Harry chewed his lip for a moment. Yeah, I'm visiting some relatives." The woman smiled. "Well, that's lovely. I'm on my way to see family as well." Harry nodded faintly, pressing his palms into his knees. "You know," the woman said thoughtfully, "people put too much stock in blood." She leaned closer. "It is often whom we choose to share our lives with that are the most important." Harry closed his eyes for a moment. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. They were silent for the remainder of the ride. When the train came to its first stop, the woman straightened up. "This is where I get off." She rose from her seat, gathering her bags. As she walked towards the exit of the train, she turned her head back toward Harry. "Keep your family close," she whispered. With that, she stepped off the train. Harry watched her go, and as the train began to pick up speed, he could see that she was headed towards the cemetery across the street. "Keep your family close, the people we choose." Harry didn't have a family, and the only person he'd ever chosen, Jade, had left him without a goodbye. Abruptly, the image of a tall, dark-haired man who'd held him during the night invaded his mind. Harry shoved it away. "He's not my family. He's just been nice to me because he's a decent person and he feels sorry for me. Maybe he doesn't mind me living with him, but it's not like he really wants me there." It didn't matter how badly Harry wanted differently. This was no time to get sentimental. He had a mission to accomplish, and the train would be arriving at his stop at any moment. As Harry disembarked, his eyes darted in all directions. The familiarity of the area was disconcerting, and a sudden chill shot through his chest, in sharp contrast to the heat outside. He studiously ignored it. The train had stopped just a few streets away from the local shopping centre in Surrey, so Harry soon arrived at his first destination, the supermarket, which usually carried back editions of the local paper. Trying to appear as inconspicuous as possible, Harry ruffled through the rack of newspapers positioned near the entrance. "I'd probably need to look through June's edition in the obituary section or something, or maybe May." He scanned June's edition with little luck. There were no articles about any deaths, and the only people mentioned in the obituary section were an 83-year-old man who had died of congestive heart failure and another man who apparently, why am I even reading this? Just check May's edition. He skimmed the paper carefully, blinking rapidly as the tiny, inked letters blurred intermittently, and then he spotted it. The deaths of Vernon Dursley, 35, and Petunia Dursley, 33, were confirmed on May 30th. According to police reports, a fire broke out in their little winging home between the hours of 3 and 4 a.m. It was discovered that a lit cigarette had been discarded in a cupboard beneath the stairs, which had made contact with an ammonia-based cleaning fluid. The son of the victims, aged 10, who had not been in the home at the time, has been taken into the custody of a relative. Harry blinked and read it again, and again. Whatever Harry had been expecting to discover, that was certainly not it. The Dursleys hadn't been attacked by an axe murderer, nor had they been accosted by dark wizards. They had simply died as a result of their own stupidity. Well, that was certainly anticlimactic, but Dudley didn't die. He's alive, probably living with Aunt Marge. As much as Dudley had bullied and tormented him, Harry felt sorry for him. And after that conversation it had with Dudley about Uncle Vernon's expectations, Harry hadn't been as bothered by the bullying. It had been so easy to see through Dudley's exterior to the insecure child beneath. And now his parents are dead, just like mine. Aunt Marge probably isn't a very good guardian for him. I mean, she drowned one of her dogs when it was ill. Harry replaced the newspaper carefully and exited the store, leaning against the window outside. He hadn't anticipated that it would be this easy. But here he was in Surrey, early afternoon on one of the hottest days of the year, unsure of what to do next. Letting his feet guide him, Harry strolled down the familiar roads that he'd frequented throughout his childhood. It felt strange to be there. It hadn't been all that long, really, but it felt like a lifetime ago the last time he'd been here, when he'd run, armed with a handful of cash and nothing much to lose. Harry blinked, and he realized that he'd reached Little Winging. There were very few people outdoors, undoubtedly due to the heat wave, and although that suited Harry just fine, it felt eerie. He reached Privet Drive and walked slowly towards the other end of the road, where number 4 was located. It was almost completely silent. All Harry could hear was the faint rustle of leaves from the almost non-existent breeze, a distant chirping of birds, and the tread of his own footsteps. He kept his head down, watching his feet move steadily. Left, right, left, right. He idly kicked a stone that stood in his path, watching as it rolled away and slipped through the bars of the gutter, vanishing into obscurity. His feet stopped moving before he fully registered that they should, and he stood still, slowly raising his head to face the house that had never been his home. There was yellow construction tape surrounding the property, and a sign with the words, "Condemned Building," had been stuck into the dirt. What was left of the lawn was cracked and yellow, and what remained of the house itself was a skeleton of what it had once been. The bricks that hadn't yet been knocked down were scorched and crumbled, and through what had previously been windows, but were now just gaps with the remains of the shattered glass still attached to the sides, Harry could see that the house had been emptied, scooped out like the inside of a clam. Although it seemed to be in the midst of rebuilding, not much progress had been made. No one was around to stop him, so Harry took that as permission to step over the yellow tape. He shivered. Though the immaculately kept garden was no longer, Harry could still see himself, clear as day, spending hours upon hours pruning it to perfection, the sun beating down on the back of his neck. Glancing to his left, he noticed that he was standing just a few feet away from where Uncle Vernon had come up behind him once and shoved him face first into the fence. Harry could recall feeling dizzy for the next 2 days. Suddenly, Harry remembered something. Could it still be there? There was something he had left behind when he'd run away, something important that he hadn't had the chance to grab as he ran from the house. But it had long since been forgotten, or perhaps pushed to the back of his mind where he would not have to think about what he had lost. It had most likely been burned away along with the rest of the contents of the house, but he still had to check. He needed to go inside. Harry wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stepped forward, nearing the entrance. The door had either been removed or burned away entirely, so Harry shut his eyes tightly and stepped through, opening them slowly when he passed the threshold. The place was unrecognizable. Every last piece of evidence that the Dursleys had resided here had been eradicated, but Harry could still make out the faint remains of what had once existed. The fireplace now consisted of crumbled brick and ash, but Harry could almost see the designs that had been carved into the wall beside it. He shuddered, turning away. There was nothing left of the kitchen. Like the rest of the house, the floor was greyish, scattered with pebbles and debris, remnants of what once had been small parts of what had made the house a home to those who lived in it, but not to him. Harry walked towards the staircase, which was now nothing more than stacks of burnt wood, and beneath it, the cupboard. Or lack thereof. Judging by the cracks in the surrounding patch of wall, there had clearly been an explosion inside, and the entire interior had been demolished. His feet moving of their own volition, Harry stepped directly into the remains of his cupboard. To a stranger, it was just a crumbled mound of wood and concrete, but Harry could still see the outline of it. His breaths grew short and sporadic. He tried to even out his breathing by taking deeper breaths, but he ended up inhaling the thick dust that seemed to cover much of the surface of his surroundings. He choked and was soon caught in the throes of a coughing fit. "Okay, just calm down before you hack up a lung." Harry's coughing fit eventually eased, and he wiped his streaming eyes with his sleeve, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He lowered himself onto his knees, ignoring the sting of pebbles pressing into them as he did so. He then shifted some of the crumbled stone from a particular patch of the floor, feeling around for that one spot. His hand tripped into the edge of a slight incline in the floor, where the concrete had been somehow dug away long before the Dursleys had lived there. When the cupboard had been intact, there had been a loose floorboard concealing it that Harry had discovered when he'd been really young. Now the board was gone, but the opening was still there. His heart beating rapidly against his ribcage, Harry tentatively dug his hand into it, fumbling around for his hand brushed against a small wooden box. He gave a faint gasp and closed his fingers around it. How is it still intact? It's wood. It should have burned away. Harry pulled it out and cupped the box in his hands. It was small and nondescript, and there was a small metal latch that held it closed. Upon further look, Harry noticed a faint glow encasing it, and when he pressed his fingers more tightly into the wood, he could feel the slight vibration of magic. So that's why it didn't burn. Harry hugged the box closely to his chest, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't had the chance to take it with him when he'd left, and he had never expected to get it back. It was best that he had left it here anyway, because it wouldn't have lasted 2 days on the streets. But here it was, intact, as though it had been waiting for him all this time. His fingers twitched with the temptation to open it, but he didn't want the contents tainted by the memories of the house. He rose to his feet, not bothering to brush the dust from his trousers. Directing his gaze straight ahead, he exited the house, kicking aside the debris that blocked his way. Harry walked down the street away from number 4, his box still pressed against his chest. The heat of the day had lessened slightly, but it did not prevent the sweat from gathering on his forehead and dripping into his eyes. He didn't bother to wipe it away. Harry walked slowly, clutching his box so tightly that his hands were beginning to grow numb. Distracted, he failed to notice the tree stump obstructing his path until he tripped over it, landing painfully on his knees and forearms. "Damn," Harry muttered, his eyes watering in pain. At least his box hadn't hit the ground. He sat up gingerly, shaking out his limbs to test for injury. Nothing seemed too badly damaged, so he pressed a palm to the floor to push himself to his feet. He swayed alarmingly when he stood, so he sat down quickly on the offending tree stump to rest for a moment. Tree stump tree. Harry sat up straight. He knew where he needed to go. He rose carefully and walked for a while longer, simultaneously dazed and hyper-aware of his surroundings, until he felt his breath catch in his chest. He had been right here at this very corner when he met Jade for the first time. He stood very still, seeing her in every movement and hearing her in every sound. But she wasn't there. She was gone, she had left him, and she was never coming back. I should be happy for her that she got away. Harry was happy for her. He wouldn't wish what they had both gone through on anyone, and she deserved to be safe and happy. Despite all that, Harry still felt the urge to cry. He missed her. Was it asking too much to be able to see the only person that had ever provided him with the tiniest shred of happiness? He clutched his box more tightly. At least he hadn't lost that, too. Harry bit the inside of his mouth harshly and continued down the route that he and Jade had taken so many times before. This was the route to safety, or it had been once. It didn't feel the same now, without her. Or is it because it's not the only safe place anymore? Harry shrugged that thought away, and before he knew it, he was entering the familiar wooded area. He kept his eyes trained on the ground as he walked, his feet dragging slightly. Why am I so tired? Harry had to fight the urge to take a rest under one of the passing trees. He could rest to his heart's content once he reached the treehouse, and there it was, right before him. Tucking his box under an arm, he made his way up the tree. The climb was more difficult than he remembered, most likely due to his exhaustion. But he reached the top and heaved himself through the entrance, and he was immediately assaulted by memories. Laughing at one of her anecdotes, just being able to talk, and know he was being heard, the scent of the food she had always brought for him, taking Jade's hand when she pretended she wasn't crying, letting Jade sit close beside him when he pretended he wasn't afraid. Harry sat with his back pressed against the wooden wall with his legs folded. Then he finally opened the box. Exhaling upon finding that everything was intact and that nothing was missing, he pulled out a worn paper and unfolded it. It was a picture Jade had drawn for him. She had been artistically talented, and unbeknownst to him, she had done a sketch of his face and later given it to him. Harry remembered that he had been momentarily speechless, as he had never before received a gift. She had flushed uncomfortably at his gratitude, but Harry could see a small smile coaxing at the corners of her mouth. What was most interesting about her sketch was the expression on his face. It was almost happy. Harry refolded the picture carefully and set it aside, pulling out a small, plastic toy soldier from the box. Not long before he had left the Dursleys for good, he had slipped into his cupboard one evening to find it on his bed. He had known right away that Dudley had put it there. That wasn't enough to make Harry like Dudley or forgive what he had done in the past, but Harry had appreciated the gesture. Though a toy soldier fixed nothing, it was still one positive thing he could cling to. There was also a stone he had made glow when he first began to experiment with his magic, and there was a bit of toffee that never seemed to grow stale, which he had received at school for getting a top mark on a test, and there was another folded paper. It was a list he had written when he was really young, back when he'd still believed that if he tried hard enough, he could get what he wanted. It read, "Be really, really good so Aunt Petunia will like me. Taste every ice cream flavor in the world. Make a friend. Find a dad." At that, Harry couldn't go on. He shoved everything back into the box and set it aside, hugging his knees to his chest and pressing his face into his arms. He dug his fingernails into his legs and squeezed his eyes shut tightly. He had gotten what he wanted, or at least some of it, and he had lost it all. He'd made a friend who had left him, and Snape. Snape didn't want him, and even if he did, Harry had certainly given it all up by running away like this. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I lose everything, and this time it's my fault. Harry sniffed, tears stinging at his eyes, and he forced them back before he broke into full-out sobs. Feeling incredibly drained, he curled up on the floor and rested his head in his arms. He lay there for a while, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. He was not quite aware of the time passing. All he knew was the familiar scent of the treehouse that had lulled him into a state of relaxation. He was so tired, a sudden rustling of the leaves outside jerked Harry out of his trance, rendering him wide awake and alert. Breathing carefully, he shifted over to peek out of the entrance, and for one heart-stopping moment, he was convinced that it was Jade. But it wasn't. He froze. It was Snape, and the expression on his face was more irate than Harry had ever seen it. And that was saying something.